Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm Councillor Judith Smythe, Chair of the Planning Committee. Please be assured that we've put appropriate cleansing and social distancing measures in place to ensure that this meeting is undertaken in a COVID-secure manner. Limited public speaking has been made available. Welcome. However, this meeting is also being webcast to allow the public to attend remotely if they so wish. Please be advised that the public seating area is not in view of the camera used to webcast this meeting. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and public gallery by the stairwells. Don't use the lifts. Please assemble by Queen Victoria's statue in Guildhall Square. In order to comply with the Guildhall Trust's fire marshal regulations, anyone who signed in at the Guildhall reception desk should sign out when leaving the building at the end of today's meeting. Can I draw everybody's attention to the fact that this meeting will be live streamed? Everyone speaking via a microphone will be on camera, including those making deputations. Members of the press and public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly that they don't wish to be recorded. Is there anybody who is wanting to state explicitly that they don't wish to be recorded? Okay. Just like to ask everybody to introduce themselves. But before we do that, I just wanted to say a little bit about chairing the meeting. I will be chairing the meeting in a way that I hope is professional and fair, but also means that we can move the meetings through efficiently without sacrificing on everybody's need or wish to speak. I won't be giving my opinion from the chair. I will be chairing it in a way that listens carefully to the questions and the answers to questions, and then we'll go on to deal with comments, and I'll listen carefully to those comments rather than imposing my view as chair on the meeting at the beginning of the meeting, which is something that we've experienced recently. And I will normally not be voting, but I will use my casting vote should it be a tie. I believe that's the way that Hugh Mason did it in the past, and I found as a member of the committee it made life much easier and much more straightforward, and the whole committee a bit more professional. So if you're happy, that's what I'm going to try to do. Bear with me though, because this is my first time, apart from a couple of times as vice chair some years ago. So and also welcome, I don't think we have, is Scott Russell here? No, I was going to say everybody else is familiar with the planning committee, so
it's me.
Russell Simpson, thank you. Welcome. I believe this is your first planning committee.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Everybody else, I think, has got previous experience, at least, of being in a planning committee, if not being on it. So thank you. So introductions around the room. If I could start, please, with members, starting with you, Darren.
Thanks, Judith. My name is Darren Sanders. I'm a member for Baffins, North Milton and South Coppenham.
John Smith, Eastern Craneswater.
George Fielding, Central South Sea.
Councillor Steve Pitt, Milton Ward.
Good afternoon, Chair. Councillor Chris Atwell, St Thomas Ward and Vice Chair of the committee.
Lynn Stagg, Ward Councillor for Baffins. Thank you.
Symes, Eastern Craneswater.
Russell Simpson, Hilsey.
Councillor Scott Pitt, Harris, Hilsey Ward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And then to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Juliette Gill. I'm the Principal Planning Solicitor at Portsmouth City Council.
Thank you, Chair. Ian Maguire, Assistant Director for Planning and Economic Growth.
Jane Dodino, Local Democracy Officer.
Alison Harper, Local Democracy Officer.
Thank you. I'll ask people who are doing deputations to introduce themselves at the beginning of the item, if that's all right. Do we have any declarations of interest in this particular agenda? Councillor Sanders.
Thanks, Judith. It's a blanket declaration. I live in a house of multiple occupation, which is currently licensed. I believe that is a personal and not a prejudicial application. Interest, sorry.
Councillor Peter Harris.
Thank you. It's just on relating to item 6, 331 London Road. Obviously, I've spoken to this one at length with my ward colleague, Councillor Dan Weems. Me and him have very much the same opinion, so I don't think it would be right and proper for me to actually sit on that application. So I'm going to sit out and deliver his deputation and slightly deliver one of mine as well.
Anybody?
Chair, not a declaration, but I have a long-standing previous engagement, which means I will need to leave between 4 and 4:30 at an appropriate juncture.
Thank you. And we have apologies for the meeting from Councillor Robert New and Councillor Peter Harris as his deputy, and Councillor Gerald Vernon Jackson with Steve Pitt. Welcome back to as his deputy. Thank you. Are you happy with those declarations of interest?
Yes, provided there are
Councillor Stagg.
I'm deputising for Hugh Mason, Lord Mayor.
Right, thank you. So another apology from Hugh Mason. Deputisation. Any more declarations of interest? Good. Okay, well then we will proceed to the agenda. I first of all got the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 13th of April 2022. Are there any matters arising from them before we go through any questions about accuracy? Page 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Councillor Lee Hunt, who was the chair up until now, isn't here to sign them. Are people happy? I was at the meeting and I thought they were accurate. Is it in order for me to sign them in that case? We yes. Yes. I propose that I'll sign them. Thank you very much. Do we have a copy to sign, or do I do that later? Okay. Thank you. Right. Well, we've got an unusual agenda before us, which is entirely on the matter of HMOs, and I'd like to first of all ask if everybody's got the list of deputations. Have you had those? And there's a SMAT here as well. Has everybody got this? Good. So we're going to propose, because of the people making deputations, that we change the agenda so that we put item 4, actually, the 118 Prince Albert Road, right to the end of the agenda after the other applications, so that those who are making deputations which are more frequent for the earlier parts of the agenda can feel free to go if they want after that item. Is that happy with that, Ian? Good. So we're going to proceed then to page 35 to the application number 2, 123 Talbot Road. First of all, Ian will introduce this to us.
Thank you, Chairman. If you will indulge me, I'll just give some broader context, because members will have noticed the 11 applications you're about to review all have a striking similarity. Members will recall a number of previous discussions regarding a decision on 3 related enforcement cases in one public inquiry, often referred to as the Campbell Properties decisions, back in April 2021. That appeal decision is a very important material consideration for the Council and indeed for this type of application. The type of application I refer to are applications where an applicant is seeking to change the use of an existing HMO, usually C4 HMO, allowing up to 6 people to live together as in a house of multiple occupancy, to a 7-bed or 8-bed HMO. Those 2 scenarios, both of which are represented on your agenda today, all but one are 7-bed, one is 8-bed, were deemed by that inspector, reviewed by your own planners and your own legal services and reviewed by outside counsel to not be a material change of use. Members will recall that planning permission is only required in two scenarios, both being development, where there is operational development carried out, or where there is a material change of use. Consequently, when a planning unit, in this case an HMO, changes how it is used, it is incumbent upon the decision maker to determine whether that change is material or not. I'll give you the direct quote from the Campbell Properties decisions to assist, and in those specific circumstances of three cases, the evidence before the inspector in those cases therefore does not give me reason to find that the actual occupation of these properties has created specific problems or caused a significant change in activity or upon the character of the area which might reflect some material change over the accepted lawful HMO use consisting of 6 residents. So that's a good précis of the test you need to apply. Is there a significant change in activity or upon the character of the area between 6 residents or, as we were about to see at 123 Talbot Road, 7 residents? In a similar 6 to 7 resident change, there was not in that inspector's view, and indeed in the view of your planning officers and legal advisors. Consequently, each application has been brought to you intentionally in a very similar way, but they all must be judged on their own individual merits. Each application must, in all cases, be assessed under applying your planning judgment as a matter of fact and degree, but of course seeking consistency and following the guidance in decisions such as the Campbell Properties decision where there has been a reasoned outcome by an informed professional inspector. For each of these cases, therefore, you effectively have 2 decisions that you need to make. You need to, first of all, see whether you agree with the officer's recommendations, which, in its first form, is that this case does not require plan permission. On the individual facts and merits of 123 Talbot Road, to start with, that change from 6 bedrooms to 7 bedrooms is not deemed to be a material change of use and consequently does not require plan permission. That judgment is extremely significant, of course, because if that judgment is correct, and officers recommend to you that it is, then the applicant, the owner of this HMO, can do the work that they've applied for without planning permission. So irrespective of what you decide today, they can do it anyway, in effect. That's a very significant fallback position, obviously, which gives very significant weight in the determination of the application. Consequently, irrespective of compliance with policy otherwise, the recommendation of officers for each of these such cases, because the same conclusion has been drawn on the individual merits 11 times in today's agenda for these planning applications, in that circumstance, as they can do it anyway, we are recommending an unconditional permission. It's the first time in my career I've ever recommended an unconditional permission. Usually conditions are entirely appropriate, but I've never been asked to look at something which we have assessed carefully and concluded does not require planning permission. So the first judgment for you on each case is, in this case, does this need plan permission and why, so we can capture that why in the minutes if that is the case. If it does need plan permission, you can obviously then, and indeed should, consider what conditions or planning obligations would be required. If it does need plan permission and you have a reason you can put into the minutes why, then very much each and every one of them will need at least 2 conditions, the time limit condition and the approved plan conditions, just for admin purposes, and a further condition to deal with a nitrates question, which will be linked to a Section 106 obligation. So consequently, if you are satisfied for the individual merits that this does need plan permission, contrary to the recommendation of officers, you can still go on to assess it, and if you are satisfied it should be granted plan permission, you should be imposing those conditions and then resolving to grant subject to 106, so the officers will go and get that legal agreement from the applicant and obviously issue the decision notice accordingly on that basis. If there's other reasons, having concluded that it does need plan permission, that other conditions need to be imposed as well, obviously they can be discussed and imposed by the committee in those circumstances. Each case, very similar though they may be, as I say, must be assessed on its individual merit. So I'll be pushing the committee on each one of these cases to first of all articulate for the minutes why, in their opinion, this does need planning permission, if that is the case, contrary to officer recommendation, and having done that, then what conditions or obligations you wish to impose upon a grant, or indeed, if there's a reason for refusal, what that reason for refusal might be. This is one of, unfortunately, a series of very similar committees this committee will be looking at, series of agendas this committee will be looking at over the next year. There's over 60 cases that are materially similar to this consequence, and we'll be bringing them forward in a regular cycle. Every third committee will be dedicated to this purpose under the current process, and consequently you'll be looking at a dozen of these every third committee, and obviously that's a significant burden upon the committee, so it is important that we do get it right each time and capture that information for the minutes so that all of our customers and residents can understand what it is being decided by the committee and why. Clearly, in light of the previous appeal decisions, officers are confident in the recommendations we've given, and while members should never be afraid of the issue of appeal, in this circumstance, there is a high likelihood of appeal should members refuse the applications against officer recommendations that they don't even need planning permission, and therefore there will be a burden of appeals arising from any decisions to refuse permission or impose unreasonable conditions on those permissions as well. The members should bear in mind as they move forward. It is incumbent upon every decision maker to act reasonably at all times, and where we have clear precedents to follow, planning not being a precedent system, but no, clearly that consistency of decision making is paramount. Those clear precedents should help guide you. As mentioned earlier, we have taken the opportunity to discuss the general issue in some detail with both legal services, and Ms Gill can provide more details on that should you wish, and indeed with external counsel who have reviewed that Campbell Properties decisions and concluded that the judgments that we are applying in general, not on these specific cases I must stress, but in general that it is quite reasonable and proper for an authority to find these circumstances to not be a material change of use. It has been gone through that extra scrutiny of seeking counsel's opinion as well. Consequently, each and every application, as I say, is brought forward with a very similar style of report and a very similar, identical recommendation of unconditional planning permission. To move to 123 Talbot Road then, Chair, if you're satisfied.
I'll just ask you one question from the chair. Thank you, George. Is it your recommendation to us that we look at the two questions separately? One, whether we deem there is a material enough change to require a planning permission, and then the consequences of that are looking at the individual case. And of course, there'll be two questions in each case. Or did you have another way forward for us? Because I thought it would be easier if we looked at the question of whether or not a planning permission is required first, with questions and comments and a resolution, and then move on to the consequences of that decision if it is that it is a material change and does need a planning permission.
It is clearly up to members how they wish to tackle that two-part decision, if you will. Clearly, one is entirely important and consequential to the other. So if it doesn't need plan permission, clearly that is an extraordinary influencing factor on whether then planning permission should be granted. Just because it doesn't need plan permission, that doesn't stop you granting it, you can do so, but if it doesn't need plan permission, that's obviously an extremely significant issue because they have the fallback of doing it irrespective of your decision. If it does need plan permission, then the corollary is equally true. If it does need plan permission and you're satisfied as that, then I would be recommending in that scenario that you do look at conditions and obligations to deal with those matters, because you have, for whatever reason, which we can capture in the minutes, deemed that this is development. So it is very much a separate two-part decision, but whether there's a necessity to discuss, debate and vote on that first question and then move to the second, or whether it can all be done in once, will really depend on how members wish to debate the matter.
I'm going to propose, if that's all right for everybody, that we do take questions all in one, questions of the report in the normal way in one, but that after that we will split and have a recommendation, ask for comments and recommendation about whether or not there's a material change, and then move on to, if we all think there is, the majority thinks there is, and therefore planning permission is required, then go on to what we think about whether planning permission should be granted or not. Does that sound fair to everybody? Everybody happy with that?
Just for clarification, you would want that process to be done on each application in turn, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Right, okay. That's fine, I just wanted clarification.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure that I'm ready to move straight on to the next item on the agenda. I've got some questions for the Assistant Director, if that's okay. Ian, are you aware that there have been, you've cited the Campbell Properties decision as a block decision on a 6 Properties by an inspector at appeal, and I've made representations at that appeal. Are you aware that there are other appeals that have been returned by the inspectors, including one that is on today's agenda, where the space standards element of PCS 20 have been upheld, and that they are in excess of the 6 that you're citing from Campbell Properties? And therefore, could you explain to the committee why you were giving 100% weight of consideration to the Campbell Properties decision, and it would appear, forgive me, no weight whatsoever to the multiple other decisions by multiple different inspectors that this committee has seen in upholding our space standards policy?
Through you, Chair. Certainly. The Campbell Properties decision was a decision where an inspector was expressly asked to resolve the question in mind. Is a change from 6-bed to 7-bed in those scenarios a material change of use or not? He, in those scenarios, judged that it was not a material change of use, 6 and 7, 6 to 8. The other appeals, and so there's several referenced in here, some are pre-Campbell Properties, actually that's not that significant as a distinction. The other appeals referenced in here, where appeals have been assessed for 6 to 7 bed changes and assessed on their own merits, did not engage that question. So it is not that an inspector has said, looking at this application, I am satisfied that the change of use from 6 to 7 requires plan permission, and then went on to assess the merits. They just simply didn't address the question of whether a change of use from 6 to 7 was required. So we do not know what the inspector's opinion of that was. Where we've challenged the inspectorate on these matters and raised them in more recent appeals, the inspectorate have declined to make further consideration because it's not necessary in their view, whether we agree or not necessarily in their view, to determine the application before them. The Campbell Properties was an appeal decision, so there was a specific ground of appeal for an enforcement matter, which was whether or not there's a breach of planning control. So the inspector couldn't sidestep the question whether this was a breach of planning control, i.e. whether this was development without planning permission. Similarly, an appeal for a certificate of lawfulness wouldn't be able to sidestep the question. But, to be blunt, they can and have sidestepped the questions where it's an application for planning permission. And they simply decreed that they're not going to answer that question. So we don't have some appeals saying this is development and other appeals saying it's not. We have 3 appeals saying it's not development and other appeals silent on the matter. And that's the distinction.
Yeah, with permission, I've got some follow-ups to try and tease this out. I understand that, but nevertheless, an inspector is only legally allowed to take into consideration in their deliberations matters that are material in planning terms. Is that correct?
Correct.
So by consideration that the points in those applications that were before them are on appeal, and you've got a number in the reports today where one was, 2 things were reason for refusing it, one was habitats, the other one was space standards. The inspector has taken a view that they would give a judgment on each of those items and therefore has recognised their materiality. They might not have agreed with them, but by making comment on them without saying, I cannot comment on the space standards because I do not believe that this is material to planning considerations. They haven't said that. They made a comment on the space standards, referenced in PCS 20, and made a judgment on it. In your own reports that are here today, PCS 20 is represented. In one of your reports today, it specifically says that space standards requirements are met. However, historically, we've always had the space standards included, and they are still council policy because that's an adopted SPD, albeit that it carries limited weight. We know that. But on one occasion, the main issues have historically always included the phrase, main issues, standard of accommodation. That's suddenly now disappeared from all of these reports as if it is no longer carrying any weight whatsoever. Yet it is still adopted policy of Portsmouth City Council. So to try and look at this in a broader sense, I went and looked what adjacent councils are doing. Sui generis permissions are required in Southampton, in Brighton and Hove and Winchester. If this momentous decision from Campbell Properties by this inspector is to carry so much weight, why are those local authorities still requiring sui generis applications to go through planning permission? Why is this not suddenly being raised in the House of Commons as a national change to planning law? Because that's actually what you're describing here. Portsmouth doesn't exist in a bubble all on its own. You are describing a national change to law that countless councils across this country enforce, and that is that it is a material change of use to go from from C4 to sui generis. We cannot, in my opinion should not, allow council policy to be completely rewritten by the opinion of one inspector when multiple other inspectors, by giving an opinion on the housing standards, the accommodation standards, have implicitly accepted that consideration of that is material. Otherwise, their response in law would have been required to be that I cannot comment on this because it's not a material consideration. I am really worried that we're charging headlong into something here, and literally today, momentously reversing an adopted council policy, and in one instance reversing officers' recommendations that were upheld by the committee, were then upheld by an inspector, and we're supposed to just say, oh no, it's all gone away. And that decision was taken several months after the Campbell Properties decision. So with the greatest respect, I do fear that there are some significant issues here that are just, we're expected to say, oh, forget all that, Campbell Properties changes everything. I don't believe it does, because we have a decision, importantly, in front of us today that you've moved to the end of the agenda, which was taken after the Campbell Properties decision, and then, therefore, in my view, in the eyes of this committee, should carry some weight. We're effectively, by moving it to the end of the agenda, dismissing any weight that it might carry with us, because we're going to consider all these other applications as if it doesn't exist until the end, because legally we have to do that, because they need to be considered separately in law. Final point I wanted to make is that Ian, very importantly, in the Campbell Properties decision, referred to these properties. That's because every single planning application, by law, has to be considered separately and on its own merits. So the inspector on those particular properties made a decision that the change of use was not material in those instances, but they specifically referred to these properties. They didn't say for all future applications from C4 to sui generis. So yes, we have legal precedent, and yes, it should carry some weight, but to sweep aside a series of other decisions made by inspectors that did give weight to our housing standards, size standards policy, is in my view a disproportionate shift of the policy of this council, and I don't think we should make in that decision today. The final point I would like to ask, because it's pertinent to a number of these applications.
Can you make this the final
I will
point,
do,
because
Judith,
these are
but this is a momentous decision for this council. And I'm sure that there are other members here today who are equally concerned by this. So the final point is about the habitats regulations, which is pertinent to several of the applications in front of us. Because I'm not aware that the issue around nitrates has gone away. And it was my clear understanding, as the cabinet member who had this dumped in their lap on the first day of being in the role under a previous head of development control, additional overnight stays is a phrase that I was repeatedly told. If it requires an additional overnight stay, it's material and it needs to be considered under nitrates mitigation. Adding a room or two rooms to a C4 to turn it into a sui generis is adding additional overnight stays. How has that suddenly disappeared? Natural England have not reversed their view. In fact, they're now taking harder enforcement action against other local authorities who didn't do what we did and come up with a proper methodology for addressing the nitrates issue. So I, for one, I do not want to place this council in a position of jeopardy for legal challenge by saying, well, we've got a decision on that, let's just move that to one side, and ignore policy that we have adopted, debated, discussed in this chamber and in exec meeting room 3 when we were talking about this over the last several years. So it's not sudden that we've got here, and I don't think we should suddenly be moving away from it either.
I've got two suggestions here. We could move to making those into questions. Some of those questions are ones I've asked Ian before in preparation for this meeting. Did other people go to the briefing on Monday at all on this? Did this come up? So there was some discussion around this thing then, and preparation of us for making these decisions in public, of course. There are probably 3 questions that you can draw out of that, and it may be worth doing that. Or do you want to make a proposal? And one of the questions would be about the comparison with the sui generis decision in other authorities that you've looked at, and the other one would be about the nitrates and where's that. In fact, the nitrates question is one that I was discussing with Ian just before this meeting started. Do you want to make this into 3 questions, or would it be better, in your opinion, if you put a recommendation that we abandon the meeting and had another one on this subject, which I know will be very difficult for officers to deal with because we're trying to remove a very big backlog. But understand what you're saying about a momentous decision. Of course it is. If you're making that proposal, then we can vote on it now.
I think what we need to decide here is whether PCS 20 in its current form is still council policy.
That is mentioned in here and it is confirmed as council policy.
Okay, so
indeed the reports are different in that respect, which is why we are expected rightly to make decisions on each application on its own merits. And the space standards are mentioned at all times.
Yes.
And the space standards, of course, are slightly different if the rooms are all very, very big. And there's one of those in this pack. So I don't know if others feel that, but I wouldn't say that that was being abandoned in
Chair,
no, well, I would take a different opinion.
Yeah. Can I perhaps, there were three, I think, very clear questions, if I may, with a little bit of indulgence to extract them. First of all, change to law, change in abandonment of policy and nitrates. The key issue, and this is a really important one, members, there is no change to law. This doesn't create new law. This is the application of long-standing law. What Councillor Pitts invited you very fairly is to imply that inspectors have, in each and every case, applied their mind to the legal question, is the application before me one that requires plan permission? And Councillor Pitts suggested they didn't apply that and concluded that it did. We have no evidence one way or the other. As I say, they're silent on the matter. One could imply they did think it needed plan permission. One could imply they made no decision about it. But that's always been the case, has been the case since 1990. So the specific wording we currently have. So the law, this isn't a change to law. Similarly, it's not a change to policy. PCS 20 is still very much council policy. It's listed as a main consideration in each and every one of these applications and should be accounted for. The key thing I would invite members to look at is, and it's not that Campbell Properties is a definitive precedent. This is a judgment that I, as your Chief Planner, in consultation with all of my planning officers, in consultation with legal services and external legal advice is giving you, in that, having taken that general advice and then looked specifically at these cases, in the same way that the inspector looked at 3 specific cases in Campbell Properties, these individual cases, let's just pick the first one, 123 Talbot Road, is not a material change of use on its own merits as a matter of fact and degree, in the same way the inspector did for those 3 cases. It is clearly open for a decision maker, this committee or delegated officers as the case may be, or indeed an inspector, to come to a different conclusion. It's a planning judgment for whatever reason. And indeed, the committee can today come to a different conclusion and say, we've looked at 123 Talbot Road, and for reason X, Y, Z, we think it is a material change of use. We've heard what the inspector said about the Campbell Properties one. This isn't one of the Campbell Properties one. This is a different site. You need to come to your own judgment. Our advice to you, our recommendation, that's been very long in formation, so we're very confident in it, but it is just that, a recommendation, is that this doesn't need plan permission, it's not material. You can decide that individual issue. To attempt a blanket judgment that they all need plan permission is to do exactly, as Councillor Pitts quite correctly said, something you shouldn't do. Campbell Properties was very clear. I wish to be very clear with you. It isn't a blanket judgment that each and every case of 6 to 7 doesn't need plan permission, or each and every case does need plan permission. It is required and expressly required now, rather than implicitly resolved, because we have this precedent here in Portsmouth that all of our agents and the specialist agents for this area are very well aware of. It is expressly required that you articulate why, in this case, it is a material change of use. But you're perfectly able to do that. That's your individual choice on a case-by-case basis. Might be some you think don't need plan permission, some that you do, for whatever reason you wish to do so. That is a material consideration. Our legal counsel is very clear on that. The Campbell Properties decision itself is a material consideration, and quite clearly whether or not there's a fallback of being able to do it without plan permission is undeniably a material consideration. It is an overriding one, in my opinion, my professional advice to you. Compliance with policy is another material consideration, a very important one. In fact, you should be making decisions in accordance with your development plan. Your development plan says you're seeking mixed and balanced communities and a good quality of amenity. The SPD, which gives you that detail of space standards in a numeric way, and the 10% door and all those kind of things, that's guidance, and that is another material consideration. Your job is to balance all of those material considerations together and determine whether they allow unconditional approval of plan permission, conditional approval of plan permission, or indeed refusal of planning permission. So I would wholeheartedly agree with Councillor Pitt's assessment, but that's the judgment you need to make 11, 12 times today, and all of those matters were very clear in the minds of officers. One of my officers has just provided me some more information as I'm sitting here, and just to give you, again, some broader context, and I'm wary of overwhelming you, but we've had another appeal decision for a similar change of use, where the inspector did, in fact, because we specifically asked, can you deal with this question, this 6 to 7 question, and here he expressly decided not to deal with it, rather than implicitly failed to deal with it, as we've got the case, and he expressly stated that, notwithstanding these decisions, Campbell Properties, whilst I have determined the appeal on the basis that the change of use has already occurred, it is not for me, under a Section 78 appeal, a refusal of planning permission, to determine whether or not the existing sui generis HMO use of the property is lawful. So he simply said, I'm not going to look at that. That is a derogation of his duty, because it is absolutely implied, and indeed has been implied by Councillor Pitt perfectly fairly, that is something you must do, and indeed I'm telling you it's something you do need to do, because how can you give weight to that fallback position or not, unless you know whether that fallback position exists or not. So you, as the Campbell Properties Inspector did, you need to make that judgment in each case. Final comment on this, if I may, before I get to the nitrates question. The key thing, and just for an important piece of language, this isn't a matter of C4 to sui generis changes of use. This is a matter of a 6-bed HMO to a 7-bed HMO. Those other terms associated with the use classes order don't really assist you in your judgment, because quite clearly, and I can easily say there will be many examples where a 6-bed HMO changing to a 10 or 12-bed HMO is a material change of use. That is equally C4 to sui generis, but it's a very different change in the activity and occupation between 6 to 7-bed HMOs. So it's important that you're looking at the merits of the individual cases, which are 10 6 to 7-bed changes and 1 6 to 8-bed change in today's planning applications. The nitrates question, just very quickly. Again, nothing, and Councillor Pitt is quite correct, has changed from Natural England. Nitrates are required where there is a development that requires that creates additional overnight stays. However, if there is no development, because it doesn't need plan permission, then they don't need to provide that nitrate issue. If you decide that it is development, then my recommendation to you is you should resolve to grant subject to 106 and the necessary conditions and seek that nitrate requirement. But quite clearly, if it isn't development, it is not reasonable to require the mitigation, because they could do it anyway. So that's a straightforward, if you will, relatively technical and administrative outcome, depending on that first question of whether or not it is development. So quite correct, nitrates is still very much a significant issue for, frankly, the whole country now, and certainly Portsmouth, but clearly it's only engaged in a planning matter where planning permission is required. And say in these cases, our advice to you is it's not, but if you come through exercising your own planning judgment to a conclusion that it is required on each and any of these cases, then indeed nitrate mitigation would be required, and appropriate conditions and obligations sought as part of that resolution.
Can I just get some clarification here? I think Councillor Pitt was implying that if any additional bed night is involved, then it is going to be a material change because of our requirements for nitrates. Is that the case or not? Is that right, Councillor Pitt?
Yeah, so a broader segment, this comes back to that judgment of materiality. What is the reason? And I don't wish to prejudge any of the individual cases before it, but as a pure thought experiment, so not assigning it to any of the individual cases here, when you're looking at whether a material change of use has occurred, what you're looking for is whether there is a significant change to the activity of that occupation. Now, in the Campbell Properties, I say, they recognising that there was, by its definition, 1/6 more activity, and describe activity as you choose, the inspector was satisfied there wasn't a material change. One of those activities that was increased by 1/6 in those cases was clearly the amount of wastewater produced, and the in-combination impacts that will subsequently have on nitrates and other issues. Other impacts would be, refuse and recycling increases, movement, noise, activity. All of these things are undeniable changes. 7 is a different number to 6. But is it a material change, is the judgment. In those cases, back in April 2021, wasn't deemed to be material in light of any of those information. However, it is a judgment for you. And if there's enough small component impacts that by increasing them by 1/6 to get from 6 to 7, that they, in your view, and it's for you to decide, do result in a material change, then the need for plan permission is engaged, conditions and obligations, and indeed nitrate mitigation would consequently flow. You just need to articulate what those individual factors on the merits of these cases are, ideally in a way that can be distinguished from the Campbell property judgments, because that's what will be tested on appeal after all, but for you to make that expressed opinion, that's what we capture for the minutes, and then you can judge the application on its merits in light of that, including the judgment of its compliance or otherwise with PCS 20.
Does that answer that particular question? It doesn't for me, because the very nature of the nitrates policy was that one single extra bed would be material. Is that correct in your understanding?
That was what we were told by Natural England. I attended, in my role as Cabinet Member at the time, cross-council discussions with lawyers, planning experts, etc., dragging ourselves all over Hampshire, meeting in different places, discussing this. We were given council's advice that additional overnight stays had to require planning permission and had to be mitigated against within that planning permission. Now, additional overnight stays clearly have the same equivalency. If you had a 6th, 7th or 8th bedroom, somebody's presumably going to sleep in it, therefore that's an overnight stay and it has an implication in planning terms. So I'm not convinced that the Campbell Properties applications on sort of hearing in this instance is relevant, because all of those properties, in fact most of them, had been in use as HMOs with either C4 or sui generis without permission for many years before we even had that hearing. So the level of weight that the inspector at that point might have given to considerations around nitrates for houses that had just, we were chasing up years and years later, and this was entirely a failing of the planning department at the time, nothing to do with Ian, but for a number of years, residents had been raising issues around this, which is why it became the Campbell Properties case, that there was a number of them, and it took an inordinately long time to get to the inquiry on it. But by then, this was all happening years before nitrates ever raised its head. So I'm really not convinced that nitrates isn't an issue here. And since Natural England is now making it much, much harder for other councils who originally were a bit blasé about this, I'm just a bit worried about the council exposing itself to risk and using the evidence for doing so against a bunch of historic applications that were pretty badly dealt with, frankly.
Chairman, can I make one final assistance in this matter, which hopefully will assist members?
Thank you.
One general point, obviously the Campbell Properties decision was made while nitrate neutrality was a requirement in existence in Portsmouth. There's a risk associated there, because if we're implying and wish to give weight to the alternative view of other inspectors through an implication that they turn their mind to that matter, well, one must give the same credit to the inspector in this case, who therefore has considered, through implication, that nitrate issue as one of the suite of changes of impact and deemed it to not be material. So if one is to give that fair overriding implication to all previous inspectors that, irrespective of what they said, they did have a holistic and comprehensive review, one must do the same. To be blunt, inspectors will potentially not. And indeed, I just gave you a quote there from a case earlier, I think end of last year, where an inspector is expressly saying, I didn't give any view to that. So I think it is fair to say, in fact, those other inspectors did not turn their minds to that question. So we don't have any contrary inspectorate view on this point. The advantage of that, if I may, is that means it's unfettered ground for you. If you believe on any individual case that in this case that impact of the additional overnight stays is, in combination with other matters or on its own, such a material change that it means the whole thing is a material change of use, then you can express that, we'll capture that in the minutes, you can go on and judge the individual applications as one normally would, having made that conclusion. That's the application of planning judgment. As officers, we've looked at that and we don't think that's the case, but that's our planning judgment recommended to you. You are here to provide your own planning judgment of the changes, and so there's clearly a change. 7 is a bigger number than 6, so that's 1/6 more wastewater. If that, as well as all the other aspects, 1/6 more recycling, 1/6 more refuse, so on and so forth, adds up in your mind to a reason why there's a material change of use on 123 Talbot, or indeed any of the others, or individually. You have to assess them all individually, but you may be a very similar response on each of them. We can capture that in the minutes, and you can go on and assess the applications accordingly.
The other question that you asked, I think, although it was more of a statement, Councillor Pitt, was about the comparison with the same circumstance in other authorities. I'm guessing that's because they've got a different policy in terms of space standards and other things, which we could have if we wanted to. Have you any answer or comments on that?
I can only give you a general point on that, because obviously this is a judgment that occurs prior to the application of policy, because it's irrespective of policy whether something needs planning permission or not. It's not a policy matter, which is why it was important to distinguish making a judgment of whether a change of use from C4 to sui generis requires plan permission. I can bring you any chief planning officer in the country in, and they say, yes, there'll be circumstances where that requires plan permission. I gave you an example myself, 6 to 10 probably does need plan permission. But, I've never seen a specific outcome from any individual planning authority asked the question, if it was a change from 6 to 7, if they were converting a second floor study room in a 6-bed HMO into a bedroom to make a 7-bed HMO, is that a material change of use? We don't have a precedent list from Southampton, from Brighton, from any of the other heavy HMO areas to say that's a different interpretation. So I've discussed this matter with a number of different lawyers, a number of different planners, discussed it with the Planning Advisory Service, a part of the Local Government Association, and they all recognise that, yes, it's an individual judgment of applying your planning judgment as the decision maker. We've done our job, our planning judgment as the recommending officers, that whether or not it's material. And in these cases, we think not. Clearly, as I say, entirely up to you to apply your own judgment and express why, if you do have a contrary view, why that contrary view is in each individual case on its own merits. Because it's not a blanket judgment. It is a requirement of every piece of work, every piece of activity, to make a judgment. Is this something that is a material change of use or an operational zone that requires plan permission? And that's what planners have to do for every single application that comes through our door. There'll be plenty of examples, and I can think of lots of examples in my own career, where you would never have seen it, because when someone contacted the council and said, do I need planning permission for X and Y, seeking informal advice, the advice was, no, you don't. And therefore it wouldn't have come in as a planning application, wouldn't have been consulted on, wouldn't have come through to a planning committee, because on a daily basis we give out advice to people about the need or otherwise for planning permission, both informally and obviously formally through certificates of lawfulness as well.
I knew this wasn't going to be a very easy committee, partly because we're dealing with one subject, and that raises in all our minds the question of the adequacy of our policies and the ways in which we can look much more widely about this question. Is there a sufficient concern in this room among members about the fact that is there a feeling amongst you all, which is implied by what Councillor Pitt has said, is that we need to gather some more information in order to report properly, in order to look at these applications, or shall we proceed as suggested on a one-by-one basis? I mean, it's within our rights collectively to say now we need more information, such as what's going on elsewhere, such as what about nitrates, and get that tested by council, although we've had reassurance from our professional advisor here that that's not the case, or not.
Chair, can I just assist on the habitats regulations? They apply, you need to carry out an appropriate assessment on the grant of planning permission.
You have to speak up a little bit, please.
Sorry. I'd just like to assist you on the habitats regulations. The habitats regulations, under those regulations, there's a requirement for an appropriate assessment. That appropriate assessment, that needs to be done where there's a grant of a planning permission, or reserve matters or prior approvals. So obviously if something doesn't need planning permission, it then doesn't need to go through the habitats regs in the same way.
Councillor Sanders.
Thank you, Judith. Two things. Firstly, having worked with Steve on the nitrates issue in 2018, because I think it came to the Cabinet paper, I can support what Steve was saying about, particularly around the issues around additional overnight stays, because that was one of the major issues that came forward. Because it was a Cabinet paper, it then became the policy of the Cabinet of this Council. So it's got a bit more weight than just this is there. Coming back to Juliet's point, and Ian's points, which I fully understand, what you're basically saying is they don't have to comply, because there are some applications in here which have been rejected by the planning inspector because of its impact on the habitats regulations. Okay? So what you're saying is basically they don't have to comply with the planning inspector's rules because they don't need planning permission. Is that one argument that's being put forward, or is that too circular?
No, on those, the inspectors have said that they are refusing them on the basis that they haven't provided a Section 106 agreement for the nitrates and the recreational bird aware payments. Had those been provided, he would have granted planning permission for them.
Sorry, Judith, I do understand that, but what I'm getting at is if one of the arguments you keep talking, in every document here there is something called the fallback position, and the fallback position is that they don't need planning permission. So if they don't need planning permission, then they don't need to provide that. Have I got that right? If I've got it wrong, please say so.
Those appeals, the inspectors have not addressed the question of are they development, do they need planning permission? So they haven't done that first step.
Okay. But one of the applications ahead of us is for non-determination. So I'm assuming, I'm not commenting on what I think of that application, but just, again, and then part of that is the habitats regulations. So I'm assuming that is of some significance. Have I got this right? Because if it's not of any significance, then we can ignore it. But it sounds like it is.
The question you, if I could help.
Yeah, of course, Judith.
The question you appear to be asking is if there is a fallback position that doesn't require planning permission, does that mean that the obligation of having an extra night, a person night in the house, means if they can get away without fulfilling the nitrates obligation?
Pretty much, yes. If I can assist, Chair, I think I'll give you the direct analogy of why it's material, if it's material. Apologies. Everyone else other than Councillor Sanders, if you live in a C3 dwelling, I do not wish, and I will not ask you to, by raise of hands, say how many people live in your C3 dwelling. It'll be a different number for all of you, I'm sure. I'll give you a personal example. In a 12-month period, my own C3 dwelling changed from 2 occupants to 7 occupants to 3 occupants, entirely lawfully, all part of the same household. I'll bore you with the anecdote another day. That obviously has significantly more overnight stays, and if I was in a nitrates protection area, my home is not, would have that notable change in impact. It is not a material change of use, however, because it is not judged by the same judgment you're applying now, the application of planning judgments, that change in occupation of activity, to be material. So therefore, it's never engaged. Same question here, different sort of dwelling, an HMO, the 6 to 7, if it is not a material change of use, that judgment is not engaged, and therefore there is no need to go through that habitat regulation assessment. As I said earlier, though, if there is, in your judgment, a material change of use, then it immediately and automatically requires that judgment all planning permissions that are likely to have that significant effect, and an increase of 1 bed space in the whole of Portsmouth is, in combination with others, likely to have that effect and consequently disengaged. So it's material if it's material. If it doesn't need plan permission, not development, it's not material. If it does need plan permission, absolutely it's material, and it should not be granted without that obligation to provide nitrate neutrality through conditions and planning obligations, which you can impose as a planning committee as part of the resolution today.
Thank you for that. Ian.
I seem to, I'm finding it a bit difficult to read the meeting, but I think you're all saying let's plough ahead and do it one by one. But is that the feeling of the meeting, or do we need to, Scott?
Just a bit of, I think Councillor Pitt and the Assistant Director have articulated these points very well. The only thing I would say is you wanted to vary the agenda. I think we need to deal with Prince Albert Road first, because that is the nature of the conversation we're having. It needs to be dealt with and get out of the way so we can actually go through the agenda. I think that would be important for process.
Do you want to comment on that?
So the merits for each of these, including the enforcement matter, are exactly the same. So I'm not sure I understand the reason why you'd want to move that forward. The suggested alteration is to allow public speakers to speak. As you can see from the agenda, we generally structure the agenda to allow deputations to occur first and then do them pretty much in date order. thereafter. So that's why it's been moved. But I'm not particularly concerned about it. As always, it's a mixture of ensuring that you're using your time efficiently. I'm just very mindful we've been here for 55 minutes and have yet to do an item of business. There are 12 items of business on here, and obviously those that have come to make deputations, I would be disappointed having to have waited this long to get to committee if we had to send them away for 3 months to come back again.
Councillor Pitt pretty well proposed that we should suspend this decision while we look at it, it seemed to me, but otherwise, should we go ahead?
No, Chair, I certainly didn't do that. I recognise, and I was very careful in my use of words, to say that every planning application has to be considered individually on its own merits. So I was concerned about a blanket change of policy affecting all of the applications, because whilst you have to do that, it would be an absolute nonsense on 11 applications that are almost identical to then come up with 11 different explanations as to why they are different from each other. So we have to have some consistency here, or otherwise equally we will be challenged by the inspectors for talking nonsense. But I don't think there's any reason why we can't consider the applications today and judge each of them individually and on its own merits. Whether we take the same view as the officers or the legal advisors, I think that remains to be seen, but I would second Councillor Hayter Harris's proposal that we move the Prince Albert Road address to the front of the meeting.
I'm going to just briefly take a show of hands about whether we want to move Prince Albert Road back to the beginning of the agenda, just because we can't go on. Just how many people want to do that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We seem to have a majority of those who are eligible to vote on that. Can we move back to that then? Let's do that. I'm sorry to those members of the deputations who we were trying to save the agony of listening further to our debate, but that's fine. So we'll go back to the order in the agenda, and we will start with item 1, which is on page 17, item 1, enforcement report. Thank you very much, Ian. If you could introduce this in the usual way, we'll then move on to questions and then comments. And if you could, in this debate, keep those two things very separate, that would be helpful.
Thank you, Chair. So the presentations here are, again, like a lot of the application write-ups, very similar. So this is different to all the other matters on the agenda. This is a matter of a enforcement case. Now, the committee will not have seen many enforcement matters. They rarely come to committee by their very nature. But because this specific question, where the determinative factor is the 6 to 7 bed change, has been promoted on an individual basis by Councillor Vernon Jackson, this, and indeed there's another half dozen or so of similar cases patiently in the queue, will come to committee for assessment. The matter of enforcement is a two-part appraisal process, so slightly different to the normal planning application. The first part is exactly the same as a normal planning application, judging the merits of the proposal. Is this something that, first instance, in each and every case, needs plan permission or not? And if it needs plan permission, is it acceptable in accordance with your policy, guidance, and indeed national policy and guidance? That's the first set of judgments. The second set of judgments is, well, even if it does need plan permission, and even if it is unacceptable, is it expedient to take enforcement action? Today's report is just really concerned with that first question. If members are satisfied that action should be taken, a further report will need to be prepared in consultation with the city solicitor on those specific steps to remedy the breach, because there's a number of different ways that can be done. The recommendation today is that there is no breach of planning control. For all the reasons we've just discussed, there is no material change of use, thus no development, thus no action to take, and the recommendation is consequently no further action. To give you the basics of it, it's just like pretty much all the other planning applications we have. So it is an existing HMO. This one's actually in an area of relatively fewer HMOs, so there's a few, I think, around the corner on today's agenda as well. An existing dwelling that is being altered to convert one of the rooms into a bedroom. That ground floor lounge, I think is the bedroom 7, I think, top of my head, is changing from lounge to bedroom 7. So it's existing 6-bed HMO with a ground floor lounge becoming a 7-bed HMO. 67 on its individual merits in this case is not considered to be a material change of use, and consequently no further action is recommended. To provide the greater depth, to assist to speed through the discussion, if members are satisfied for whatever reason, this does need planning permission, and therefore there is, if you will, a case to answer. Members will then need to turn their minds of its compliance with policy. In this case, I can advise you, members, that a key material consideration, as discussed elsewhere in the report, is, as one would expect, that quality of internal communal living standards. There is about 29.8 square metres of communal living standards, and for a 6 or 7-bed HMO, we would expect to see 34 square metres. So it has less communal living space than we would normally require in such circumstances. I would mention for completeness that this site has already been licensed by your private sector housing team, who have obviously undertaken an individual assessment and deemed it to be acceptable for 7 people. Licensing is a parallel process to planning, but obviously it undertakes much of the same judgments in terms of the quality of that internal space, and your private sector housing team have deemed that this is acceptable for 7 people, and indeed they licensed it on the 1st of April 2020, I think it is. The licence is in the agenda for a 5-year period, so it's been licensed for that purpose. That's obviously been brought to our attention, hence the enforcement investigation. As I say, recommendation is that no further action be taken. If members, because they didn't breach of planning control, I would add further to that even if it is a breach of planning control, i.e. it needs plan permission, we would still be recommending no further action, because while it doesn't comply with the technical justification, it's 29.8 square metres against 34 square metres for internal floor space, and while that has been found unacceptable by this council, by the planning inspectorate, I won't mince words about that, it has been found acceptable by the licensing team to be a reasonable living environment for 7 people, and consequently it would not be expedient in our view to take enforcement action even if there was a breach of planning control. However, both those judgments, whether there's a breach of planning control and whether it is, as non-compliant with your guidance, an unacceptable living environment, thus it's expedient to take enforcement action, is the judgment for the committee today.
Thank you, Ian. Are there questions, specific questions? I'll take Councillor Sanders.
2. Judith, if I may, just for clarification. You say the licensing was granted in April 2020, yes? Is it right that in paragraph 1.3, planning permission for this application was refused on 18th of January 2021? And so that it was refused after the licence was given in the first place. Okay, fine. In paragraph 1.5, we have the inspector's quite detailed judgment, for which thank you for Ian and the team for putting that forwards. Has the applicant changed anything about the application in line with that inspector's judgment? Anything?
To my knowledge, no. I would add that the property, I think, has recently changed hands. I don't want to be unfair to the applicant versus the current landowner. Yes, to our knowledge, no, there's been no change since the refusal and dismissal of planning permission.
Those are my 2 questions, Judith.
Any other questions? Councillor Pitt.
We've had this debate around the relevancy of licensing. At one point, when Bruce Lomax was head of private sector housing, he used to come to planning committee and they used to go around the houses. Ian, are you able to give us a view as to what stance you would have taken on this application, therefore, if private sector housing had refused to license the premises? Because you're saying that in light of their decision to license it, but their decision to license it is not material consideration for us within a planning application because it's a parallel regime. So what's your view on that?
To say that their decision to license it is immaterial, I think is probably not true. How much weight one gives to it as a material, there's very few things that are immaterial, to be honest. But because obviously what we're doing is using those considerations to help us assess and guide and see whether we wish to overrule our development plan. And don't forget, our development plan simply says, we're looking to create good living environments, I paraphrase. BCS 20. The guidance, that specific number, 34 square metres, is guidance and a material consideration. So it's not the development plan, it's only guidance. That is obviously a way to help us decide and to consider the quality of that internal living environment. That's exactly the same judgment that the private sector housing team have done, indeed with the same numerical guidance. They go to site and apply their professional judgment as to the quality of it, having that 34 square metres in their hand and saying, right, we know this is only 30, but is it acceptable? And in this case, they deemed that it was. If they had gone there and said, look, it's below the guidance and for whatever specific additional reasons, it's also unacceptable, because the layout's wrong or the quality of the layout is unacceptable, then for us to say that it's less than guidance and if it needs planning permission, we've skipped through that question and I will be asking members to come back to it, but on the basis, Councillor Pitt, that is already your conclusion. If it needs planning permission, that's something that's below our guidance and unlicensable. It would be an odd decision to say, well, actually, having done our inspection with exactly the same, if you will, quality of guidance, we've come to a different conclusion. So if they'd refuse to licence it, then it is more likely, and we're in the world of hypotheticals here, it is more likely that we would be recommending a refusal of plan permission about the quality of internal living environment. But as a point of fact, they didn't refuse to licence it. They found that it was a quality living environment, and that similarly has some weight. How much, down to you as decision makers, some weight to be given to the whether or not it's an acceptable living environment, and thus whether or not it complies with policy, if policy is suitably engaged to that way, because it is plan permission.
Any other questions? We don't have any deputations on this. I just am advised by the city solicitor that if you absent yourself from a meeting, from an item, you won't be able to vote on it. Just thank you. Move then towards comments and recommendations. Thank you. I'm going to go with the committee first. We don't normally accept deputations that haven't been... we can invite... No. I thought that. No. I've just had legal advice. Let's just take some questions. Yeah. We'll take some questions from the floor first. George.
We're on comments now, I believe, Chair.
Comments, yes, comments.
As Councillor Sanders quite rightly questioned, we're considering an application that's both been refused by this committee before and dismissed at appeal. So I can't see how we can say today that that we can make a decision that no further action should be taken effectively.
Do you want to make that into a recommendation at this stage, or?
Chairman, I will have to intervene. You must make the consideration, and you must make a two-part consideration. I'm afraid, members, you have no choice. You're here to make that decision, tied up to what decision you want to make. You must deem whether or not this needs planning permission. And if it does, whether action should be taken. It's not something you can abrogate and just say, well, it's been made before. It's been made in ignorance of a key matter, is the advice. You need to address that key matter. Does it need plan permission? Express a reason why it needs plan permission. If that's the case, we'll get that in the minutes. Then you can go on to make that judgment, which may be exactly the same as the appeal inspector was, that it's an unacceptable living environment, or it may be the same as the private sector housing team who thought that it is an acceptable living environment. But you need to turn your mind to those two parts of decision making.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Darren.
I do wish to make a recommendation, which is that firstly, I do think it needs planning permission on the grounds that in the final paragraph of the inspector's report, and I will quote this. It says, consequently, I therefore find the under provision of communal space would cause harm to the living conditions of occupants of the property. Consequently, the proposed development would not accord with PCS 23 of the local plan. The proposal would also be contrary to the SPD, that's Portsmouth's SPD, which amongst other things seeks to ensure that communal spaces within HMOs meet a minimum space requirement. Therefore, I think the planning inspector has worked out this might need planning permission, and that this is a clear planning issue and a clear contravention of planning policy. So therefore, I think for us to turn around and go, no, it ain't, is wrong, given the nature of the inspector judgment. Two, I do think further action needs to be taken on the best advice that we have from our assistant director. There has been no change in line with the inspector's judgments, and so as such, I believe that action should be taken. If I'm happy to quote PCS 23, as the inspector has done, happy to quote the SPD, as the inspector has done, but it seems that we've had an inspector's judgment, and the developer has done nothing with it. And that seems to me to be concerning, and therefore I propose, one, that planning permission is required for this, and two, that enforcement and that further action is taken.
Let's deal with those one by one, as we've been asked.
My apologies, Judith.
One, that you are proposing that planning permission is required, and we'll deal with that first, if there's a seconder for that.
Yeah, I'm happy to second that.
Chairman, I will need to assist. Just to assist members here so that you don't fall into the same challenge. Compliance with policy is not a relevant matter for judging whether or not it's a material change of use. Perfectly relevant for judging whether or not, having identified that it's development, it should be granted or action should be taken. But the wording, Councillor Sanders, you just put forward would not be robustly capable of being upheld. It has to be an attribute of the change, not a policy compliance with the change that results in a material or not change in that use. So whether or not it complies with the policy is actually of no relevance to whether or not it's development. There are many things out there one can do which are entirely contrary to the policies you've laid out in your local plan that are not nevertheless development.
So we're looking here as to the reasons why we think it is a material change. And we don't need to look directly as to why it was refused before by the committee or by the inspector. What reasons would...
It is a material change because the under-provision of communal space would cause harm to the living conditions of occupants of the property.
Councillor Pitt.
Chair, if I can be helpful,
Thank you.
I think to preface Councillor Sanders' recommendation based on the policy, which is the reason once we've decided that this is something that constitutes development, we could precede it by saying that we believe that the standard of accommodation, the impact on parking, waste and the amenity impacts on neighbouring residents and the impact upon the Solent Special Protection Area mean that this constitutes development, and therefore we reject it as articulated by the inspector on page 18 of our pack in the paragraph that begins, I therefore find, and ends with future user.
Would that be a...
Is Ian happy with that?
I'm trying to separate... Thank you, that's very helpful. I'm trying to separate out the two recommendations. Is this a material change that requires planning permission? And then, if it isn't, what do we do with it? Could you guide us, please?
Just to deal with the first half, nothing that Councillor Pitt just said leapt out as me as being a problem, but there was a lot said. Could you repeat it for me? The standard accommodation, the impact...
I can. So the standard of accommodation, the impact on parking, waste, the amenity impacts upon neighbouring residents, and the impact upon the Solent Special Protection Area.
So the only guidance I can give members to that, and thank you, is, as I said earlier, 7 is a bigger number than 6, and clearly every single one of the things just raised by Councillor Pitt is capable of increasing by 1/6. What members need to do when coming to their conclusion based on if Councillor Sanders is happy to have Councillor Pitt's words placed in your mouth, is whether that change in each and every one of those is such that it would be material, or indeed sufficiently material when looked at in combination, that it results in a material change of use on the individual merits of this application. So all of them are planning matters, all of them are changes, whether cumulatively or individually they result in materiality, is the judgment that can be made on that first part of the decision.
Councillor Pitt.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that this is getting a lot bogged down in policy, but I agree with Ian, but the reason that we need to, in my view, we need to do this is we have the view of an inspector on a bunch of properties. We have a view of a number of other inspectors who have chosen specifically not to consider or comment on that. So we need to test that further, because as Ian's just read to us not 10 minutes ago, we've had another appeal decision back where the inspector has refused to take this into consideration. Now, if that continues to happen, the space standards within the SPD that exist give us a valid reason in planning policy terms to reject those applications for sui generis HMOs that do not meet, in our view, quality living accommodation required by PCS 23 for local residents. This is what we started out to achieve 6 years ago when Councillor Jones was the leader of the council and she worked with my former colleague Councillor Wood to try and get to this point. We've then gone through a tortuous process of changing SPDs along the way, all the time trying to get the local development plan finalised. And at which point this may be a moot point, because if it's in the plan, then it has to carry more weight than it does in an SPD where it's only guidance. And we're advised of that today. So I take on board what Ian said, but I strongly believe that in this instance, anything other than the recommendation put forward by Councillor Sanders will be folly.
And Judith, yes, I'm happy to take on board all the words that Councillor Pitt uttered as a preface.
So I have a proposer, I have words for it, and I have a seconder. Is there anybody else who wants to comment and put an alternative proposal if they so wish?
Chairman, with apologies for a further intervention, just to pick up on this, because as Councillor Pitt said, this is very important that you do get
I've missed this.
Exactly right. Of that list, there's nothing in there of particular concern. The key issue, and I was just looking at the wording of the choice of standard of accommodation, the key issue, of course, is you're not saying in this aspect of the decision, clear distinction there, that this is unacceptable. You're simply saying it's materially different. The second aspect of your decision, Councillor Pitt has run ahead and given you his opinion already, but absolutely fine. The second aspect is whether that standard of accommodation is acceptable. So arguably it's not actually the standard of accommodation that's the change of materiality. It is the intensification of the use of that standard of accommodation. But I think we can tie ourselves up in not too much. I just want to make sure members have that clearly in their mind when they make that judgment. And as a final point, and I hope you do leave a final point on this matter, to be absolutely clear, this is not the judgment of a single appeal inspector being placed before you. This is the judgment of the case officer as approved by myself. This is my professional judgment. I'm not advocating saying that an appeal inspector has made the ruling, you must follow it. I am advising you, as your chief planning officer, this does not need planning permission. Absolutely, you don't have to agree with me, as long as you've got articulate reasons, and we've got half of those already here. But just to be absolutely clear, this isn't Bristol imposing decisions. This is your professional advisors advising you this doesn't need planning permission, and you just need to be conscious of that when you make your decision, as indeed you can progress to do so now.
So are you happy to accept the...
I'm happy to accept the amended form of words that do not reflect necessarily directly on the standard of accommodation. I apologise, but I lifted the words from the officer's own report, which is in part of the pack.
No, there are no alternative proposals to consider. Can I ask that we move to a vote to agree that this is material development for the reasons cited in the phrases put together by Councillor Sanders and Councillor Pitt? Raise your hands if you agree with that. I'm sorry, you can't vote. Okay, so we have 5 people. Six. Thank you. 6 in favour of that, and that's 6 out of the total of I think it's carried, because you're not allowed to vote. So we have decided that this is development, a material development, and we need now to move on to say whether or not we would, and we're straight into comments here, want to grant this change from 6 to 7, it's an enforcement action, whether we want to take enforcement action against the 7 beds currently in use. Is there a proposer or a seconder?
I think this one's different than all the others. We've just made a decision, and therefore it has an automatic implication that we should enforce.
Yeah, no, I think we could still decide we didn't want to enforce. Technically, couldn't we, Ian? Yes, we could decide, yeah. Yes, please.
It says that this is a different there's a lot of two parts to this. So even there's a breach of planning control, that doesn't mean your planning enforcement is a discretionary service. A classic example is a construction of a 2.1 metre rear garden fence. It's 10 centimetres taller than it should be. Rarely would that be expedient to take enforcement action. Your first judgment, which is why I was not talking too much about the standard or say whether it's unacceptable, it's whether it's material. You've judged it's material. Is that material change on a person unacceptable? So you've got 7 people using communal living space that's substandard against your SPD rather than 6. Is that so harmful that it is, and to be blunt, worthy the interference with the human rights of the landowner? That's what enforcement was all about. That's why it's discretionary, so that a enforcement notice or other action can be taken. Just to be, with apologies, to speed the debate up, obviously we had a number of debates, and again you need to make your own judgment afresh now, but previously an inspector looked at that and said, looking at the individual merits in this case, that space, 29.8, isn't it, 29.9 for 7 people is unacceptable, and consequently you could come to that same judgment. I will give you one word of caution, if I may. As I say, the private sector housing team have looked at it and disagreed with the inspector and said, no, this is acceptable. They've licensed it under their written parallel but extremely relevant regime, so there's a judgment to do with that. I would also highlight that you have several applications on today's agenda with smaller living spaces and similar linear layouts, which were deemed acceptable by the inspectorate. We've got inconsistencies, and they're all justified as being judged on their own individual merits. So the individual merits of this, 29.9, is unacceptable to an inspector, and indeed a planning committee is at one point, so you can agree with that. However, smaller spaces with pretty much exactly the same layout in other places were deemed acceptable by both inspectorates and indeed obviously your licensing team. Each and every one of the applications on today's agendas has been licensed by your licensing team as an acceptable living environment. So you have to put that balance together.
I think we need to take this step by step. So what we need now is to have comments in support of taking enforcement action or comments against taking enforcement action, with recommendations accordingly. Councillor Symes.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with Ian over the spaces. If you look at the other rooms on the other applications, some of them are quite a bit smaller. And would that mean then that we will be implying that enforcement action should be taken on those if we decide to refuse them? Is that what the implication would be? I'm not quite sure.
Implications are a dangerous word. So some of these are retrospective, some are not. Some may well be retrospective while we've been sitting in this room because there's some of the alterations are relatively straightforward. It's just turning a study bedroom into a study into a bedroom. So that's literally just changing the furniture. That may well have happened since we last photographed the site. So while they're licensed for 7 or 8 in 2 cases, that doesn't mean they're being used, because a license allows you to have up to 7. One would hope, and one has every reason to presume, that people act lawfully. So just because it's licensed for 7, that doesn't mean they are using that 7th room as a bedroom, because they don't have planning permission for it, and they may be waiting for today's decision, for example, to start letting that room. So consequently, there will be no need for enforcement action. But that's obviously a judgment that would be followed up on an individual case-by-case basis, depending on the outcome of the individual cases we're looking at today.
Any further questions? That's a question, really. Thank you. Comments on this? Councillor Pitt.
Yeah, similarly to what Ian said, it says that the licence covers it for occupation by no more than 7 persons. The inspector's taken a contrary view to that. I think it would be unwise for us to be overruling the inspector because of the detailed nature of their response. And it's quite an unusual response that they've given here compared to other responses that we've had on this issue over space standards. They've identified actually not just the reason that we identified, which is insufficient communal space, but they've gone on to talk about the narrow nature of the room, the restricted size of the garden, etc. And it would be a mistake for us to just look at the numbers in these applications and say, oh, well, that's short by 5, that's short by 6. You do have to look at the configuration of the rooms and the usability of those spaces. And since the inspector's made some very specific comments on this one to say that it's particularly narrow, very limited outside space, effectively it's a corridor, and the inspector themselves has articulated that, I wouldn't feel comfortable in taking a different view to the professional who's actually responded on that item in such detail.
That's on the top of page 18 in italics. Yourself, Darren.
Thank you. Just to support what Steve is saying, in my other lives I oversee the private sector licensing team, and there are frequent discussions and frequent tribunals, frankly, about the space standards and how big they are and whether actually opening a door inwards counts or not. And what I have always said to the licensing team is, you take notice of the tribunals. When private landlords have complained to the licensing team, perfectly understandably, that, the space standards are too much and, they must be smaller and other authorities must be smaller, I've always said to them, you stick with what the tribunals say. And they tend to. So I think in this particular case, because we have a planning inspector, which, as Steve has said, has given incredibly detailed, much more detail than anything else in here, comments, it seems wrong, particularly when we attach such weight to the planning inspectors in other circumstances, to turn around and go, no, terribly sorry. So if Steve wasn't proposing that we take enforcement action, I will. And I'm happy to do so on the basis of, as Steve has said, that the inspector's been very detailed, and sadly, the developer and the owner has not acted on it according to Ian's best advice. If the house has changed as a result of the inspector's actions, then we can review that. But I think based on the advice that we have, the logical thing to do and the consistent thing to do is to press for enforcement action.
Do we have a seconder for that? Okay. You're seconding each other. It doesn't matter. Okay.
We'll sort it out later, Judith.
Is there a proposal coming up from the floor or not? If not, we'll move to...
Chairman, if I may assist, so we have the specific wording for the minutes from this two-part decision-making. What I've captured from that debate as we go forward is that the intensity of the accommodation, the impact on parking, waste, amenity impact upon neighbouring residents, and the impact on the Southern Special Protection Area results in a material change of use of this site requiring planning permission. And furthermore, the amount of communal living space below that recommended by the HMO SPD results in an unacceptable living environment for occupants, warranting enforcement action. Because that's obviously the question you're looking at now. If that's, and I'm seeing nods from the two members, if I may, Chairman, just to be absolutely clear, so members are under no illusions, the conclusion warranting enforcement action is effectively us to bring back another report to you if necessary. As Councillor Sanders has said, we don't know what the landowner may do. The first thing we would do in an enforcement action is to write to them and say, oi, change that room back to a lounge. If they do that, then there is no further. The enforcement action may simply be that informal issue, in which case I can just drop you an email to say there is no longer a breach of planning control based on that outcome. So it may be that there's no need for a formal enforcement notice. However, if the applicant refuses to do so, then obviously an enforcement notice would need to be prepared with appropriate steps of remedy, etc., in consultation with the city solicitor, and that would come back to this committee in due course.
Would it not be more politic, Stephen Darren, to in fact use as the reasons quoting the inspector's report with all its details, so there's no avoidance of doubt as to what we're doing? should there be another appeal.
If I may, this isn't a matter that's able to be appealed. No, when we write to that's why I say we need to bring back, if we need to do an enforcement notice, that would obviously have a much more detailed, robust issue directly referencing. This is simply for the purpose of the minutes, so that we know that you've instructed your enforcement team to go away and take enforcement action. Yeah.
So, do we have? Can we all vote on that proposition, which is promoted and seconded? Please raise your hands if you agree. You still can't do it. What have you got? 7. That's 7 in favour. We've agreed that. Thank you. Move on then to item number 2, page 35. And here we do have, after Ian has made the case, I will then ask Maxine Higgins. Is she here? Not here. Do we have anything to read out from Maxine Higgins? No. Henry Thorpe, who is here. Thank you. And Councillor Horton, who is here. Thank you. So, Ian, over to you.
If we could have the presentation on the screen, please. One, 2, 3 Talbot Road. There it is. An area with a number of HMOs already in that locality. It's obviously an existing 6-bed HMO. Let me just find my sheet of notes. They are seeking a change of 6 occupants, why was that not working, to 7 occupants. That is an existing floor plan. I draw your attention to the far top right, the 2nd floor study room, turning into bedroom 7. That is the nature of the change of the occupation. I won't go through all the details again. That change is not considered to be material by officers and consequently resulting in no material harm. There's a few images of the quality of the environment that's been created of the existing property. As it is overridingly material consideration that there is no change in our view, unconditional planning permission is recommended. If members come for whatever reason to an alternative conclusion that planning permission is required, then obviously appropriate conditions and obligations, most notably nitrates, would have to be imposed as part of a resolution to grant planning permission. All the other material considerations are contained within the report, and of course I'm happy to take any questions.
Deputations first, then. We have got the first person who's actually here, I think, is Henry Thorpe. Henry, you have, I think,
5 minutes.
6 minutes.
6 minutes, 6 minutes. Hello all. I've made a number of deputations on HMOs, and I could hear the way that the previous conversation was going, so I didn't really fight to make another deputation on the issue. I'm glad that some consideration is being done on policy reform for it, and particularly the last HMO failed a lot of policies and it failed a lot of processes. It shouldn't have even been a HMO, because in 2020 it was given planning permission even though it was over the 10% threshold, but the officer's report never looked into it. Then it was given a large extension, which meant that there's no way it could meet part of its requirements to do with bicycle storage, etc., and then it was sort of overthrown by the inspector. If we take this one, 123 Talbot Road, it's very clear that this is yet another overdevelopment within the city. If you look at the top floor of that building, that is a 3-storey building with vertical walls and a flat roof. That is not, when you talk about increasing nitrates, in my view, putting 9 bedrooms in is fine. That's not the issue. The issue is the occupancy, because that's what drives it. So the fact that you can put 9 bedrooms into it is fine. The problem is the nitrates issue is caused by the number of residents that are within it. If we look at that development, there's a very clear part in the SPD, which is 2.3, which states where planning permission is sought to change from C4 or mixed C3, C4 use in areas of concentrations of HMOs of over the 10% threshold, then basically you have to consider a load of other community impacts, which this report hasn't assessed. The communal area is undersized at 26.84 metres, and it needs to be 34. And if you look at that communal area again, and it's funny that the last conversation happened, the first thing I was going to bring up is that that communal area isn't a communal area, it's a corridor for even that area, so it's actually lower than 26.4. I don't know what you're doing with the bicycles that always seem to get dragged into this, and I would encourage you that the key to HMO policy is an ability to control the scale of them. If you can't control the policy of the scale, then residents themselves are going to push you into basically reducing the numbers to a very small percentage. Would you really want this house next door to you? Have you made any consideration into the environmental impacts of that building? Because that hasn't had any soundproofing, it hasn't had any upgrades. It's just a mess, really. And it's another low-level, low-standard development. I'd encourage you to reject it based on the communal area sizes and on the fact that the SPD percentage is already at 40.6% within that area, so therefore any further intensification isn't justified. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Councillor Horton, I believe you have 6 minutes as well, or is it more?
Yeah. I believe that's what I was told.
Stick with 6 then if you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I obviously understand that each application needs to be considered on its own merit, and therefore I'll be speaking as a ward councillor 3 times during this meeting in relation to the 3 applications in Central Southsea Ward. Some of what I will say will be repeated in order that there's clarity that the points I'm making are refer to each of the applications and not just this one, so I apologise for that in advance. And I just want to start, and I'll say this for all of them, by saying that actually I've said many times in this, when I've been on this committee, that there is a need for high quality shared housing in this city. And like many people in this room, I've probably lived in shared housing, and I wish that much of it had been of the high quality HMOs that I've seen approved at this committee. So coming to 123 Talbot Road, it's already been through this committee with a recommendation for refusal, as we've discussed in February 2020. The reasons for refusal were based on space standards, 7.16 square metres short of the communal space, and the nitrates issue, and we've obviously discussed those things. The report says that the appeal regarding the determination was not upheld by the regional planning inspector, and yet we have it back in here. Interestingly, the report uses one of the inspector's comments, the one as a way of recommending approval this time, but we're also dismissing the other reason, the one that the inspector did agree with on this decision. But the focus here today is to do with whether the change from an HMO up to 6 people is materially different to a sui generis with 7 or more people. And I would argue that there's absolutely a materiality to the change in use. The material planning considerations most frequently cited in such applications as these, where there's little or no change to the bulk or mass of the building, are related to, as we've rehearsed, traffic, parking issues, noise, impact or character or appearance of the area, and the impact on the community and other services. I note that the comments on this application ask us to revisit principles of the HMO policy, and I suggest, if I'm reading it correctly, that the HMO policy is only dealing with the number of houses in that interpretation rather than the number of occupants, and which we've just heard a comment about that there. In other words, we're dealing with buildings, not humans. So logically, we could take all the HMOs, change them to sui generis, add a minimum of 1 person to each of those houses, and according to the argument in the report, there would be no material impact on residential amenity. And I just don't accept that to be the case, and nor do many people living in and next to these houses. So the argument goes, as we know, at least one more person, so let's just say it's one more person's rubbish, car, flushing the loo, 1 more person's opening and closing the front door, 1 more person's radio on, etc., will be no material change to that area. Whilst that might be the case if it was a one isolated example, and I know we're encouraged to take each one on its own merit, how on earth can we be reasonable and empathetic decision makers and ignore the context of these applications? How can we separate the decision from the number of HMOs in the area and the number of SUIs already in the area? To add one bedroom to each of those properties in a 50 metres radius of this house on Talbot Road would be to add at least 6 more 4-bedroomed houses. We talk about mixed and balanced communities, and the report here seems to come down to the question of whether the term balance is in relation to the number of properties or the human beings in those properties. And I'm here to argue that expanding HMO after HMO in areas which already have a density of shared housing by just one is having a detrimental impact on the living conditions for those people in the community. As I said, we need high quality housing stock, but we need it in the right places in the city and not taking what were originally 2 up, 2 down houses and stretching them into ridiculous shaped houses where the living conditions inside are not good, and we're in areas where they're already saturated. I read the report carefully, and the main issues for consideration in the determination of this application are around the principle of development, including the compliance with the policy, and I've outlined what I believe the spirit as well as the detail of the policy is about habitation and the number of people, not the number of buildings. It's also important to note that, just as in the case of the original determination, this particular application fails to meet our own policy space standards, where we try and protect tenants from being crammed in. Second, we're asked to look at the impact of amenity, and I project that any additional numbers will have a material impact on both the individual property and the character of the surrounding area, and especially with the removal of shared living. Therefore, notwithstanding the comments in the extensive discussion before, I disagree with the Planning Officer's recommendation. I urge the committee to yet again refuse permission on the basis that this is development that makes a material difference due to the over-intensification of use in this area.
Beautifully timed, thank you. Can I turn to questions, please? Again, we need in this one to be clear that we think it's a material change and therefore needs planning permission before coming to a conclusion on this one. Is that right? Or can we move straight to...
Yes, again, it's the same two-part judgment on its own merits. Obviously, a lot of the merits that have been discussed, parking, are all, factors that may or may not materially change, and you can come to that judgment. Just one thing I probably need to clarify from the back of those representations, just to be absolutely clear for members, because it was referenced, this is a site that has been refused by Planning Committee, it hasn't changed since that time, gone through appeal, and the space standards, below standard though they may be, were deemed to be acceptable for 7 people. So different to what you've just looked at, where the space standard, larger than what we have here, but nevertheless below space standards, this one was deemed to be acceptable by the planning inspectorate. So the same way that you felt it appropriate to take on the inspector's logic of having looked at the individual merits of the quality of space to be unacceptable at 118 Prince Albert Road, in this case, if you took the same logic rather than judgment, then the space standards at a smaller size with this different orientation, obviously it's a more square than linear layout, would be acceptable from the issues, notwithstanding their failure to comply with the numerical space standards.
So, two-part decision again. Councillor Pitt. Steve.
Ian, you're asking us to grant unconditional permission. If we don't make a determination on that, the status quo stays. The inspector has made a judgment. The inspector's rejected the application based on the habitats and nitrates stuff. They've said that it is acceptable in terms of space standards. You are asking us to answer a question for you. My question to you is, do we have the opportunity to change the question that you're asking us and to just say that the committee recommends no further action?
This is a planning application. 123 Talbot Road is a planning application from the applicant.
Did the applicant ask you to bring it back to the committee?
Yes, this is a new planning application. They reapplied following this judgment. Yes, sir. Okay, so there's a number of these that have gone to appeal in the past, and they're back in now for redetermination by this council. So we can't refuse to determine they are live planning applications that require resolution.
says it was a application put in on the 26th of August 2020. Sometime after we previously refused it, I think.
Where's the applicant's representation?
If I may, this is just to be absolutely clear, say the appeal on the materially similar circumstance was dismissed on a reading from 1.13 by the Planning Inspectorate in August 2020. The applicant then made a new application, materially similar, with the same merits, back to this council to seek the same things, a 7-person issue. The applicant, of course, is under no obligation to come along and speak to the planning committee. The application must be judged on its individual merits.
Okay.
And just to follow that up, as a question from the chair, had the applicant was prepared to satisfy the reason that the inspector gave for dismissing the appeal, in other words, the mitigation for nitrates?
Yes, to make a clear distinction, because this comes up a number of times, the reason we've got a number of these on here that the inspector found acceptable on space standards but then dismissed an appeal purely on the nitrates issue is the inspector on appeal does not have the freedom to say, OK, go away and give me a Section 106 agreement and come back, which is exactly obviously what this planning committee does almost every time it has the need for a Section 106 agreement. So, if we haven't got through that one, but if you judge this does need plan permission, then the recommendation would be to obviously grant it in accordance with the inspector's judgment on space standards, but that grant would be a resolution to grant subject to the 106 for nitrates and obviously any other conditions you think are necessary as well. And yes, we have spoken to the agents representing all of these, and they are in general principle willing to enter into those obligations on that basis. Clearly, however, they're more happy to see our recommendation that it doesn't need development and therefore they don't need to enter into that obligation. But having spoken to them for the agents individually, they are satisfied that that may well be the other outcome, that plan permission is granted and no obligation is needed.
Follow up, Steve?
All of them, Ian. They've all said the same thing, that they would accept, on these relevant ones, they would accept the nitrates provision if that was the decision.
So I haven't spoken to all of them, as I've spoken to agents, and there's many of these have the same agent, and they've accepted, yes, and they're satisfied that if it needs plan permission, they recognise those conditions and obligations to deal with. But whether or not they accept it is actually not that relevant. You can make that judgment for them. And obviously if they refuse to, because don't forget your resolution, the standard wording of your resolution is to delegate to me to grant subject to that obligation. If they, contrary to the information that I have, say actually we refuse to do so, then obviously we're back to a point where you haven't given me delegated authority to do it, and that would be a reason for refusal.
I just find it really interesting that if they've taken agents' advice, and you're saying that you've spoken to their agents, that their agents have advised them to accept something when they surely should have been advising them that the Portsmouth City Council had no right to class this as development.
That's what they've already done, but there's a degree of real-world pragmatism here. The nitrates and payments are a couple of £1,000s. Every month, if they were to appeal it for your refusal, that would take many months to go through. It's their business. It's much more sense to send out a quick obligation with a couple of £1,000s on it and start bringing in that rent receipt from the 7th bedroom. So there's a mixture of what is the correct outcome and what is pragmatism, and obviously their agents are providing them that broader pragmatic guidance, I would suggest.
But the first decision, further questions? Did you have one to ask?
Yes, thank you, Ian. So in this particular case, has the agent said yes, that they will pay the licence? Sorry, they will pay they will take mitigation action?
I'll ask the case officer to confirm whether, on this specific case, this is the agent who I've discussed with, who is the agent for most of the agenda.
Right.
And she has advised me that, no, that pragmatism is the advice she's giving to all her applicants, and she's not informed us to the contrary, but I will be able to feed back to you.
It would be useful. And the second point, you said in the previous application that all of them had been licensed. Paragraph 3.1 says that this property would require to be licensed. Is that right?
That's page 36.
Yes, it's paragraph 3.1, it's under 3.0, which is consultations.
Certainly. So there's a standard consultation goes out to private sector housing on all HMO applications, and their response is relatively straightforward, and they have confirmed that this is a type of HMO that requires to be licensed. We double-checked this morning on the status on each and every one of the HMOs in today's list, and I can confirm that this one was licensed for 7 people on the 25th of November 2019.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Any other questions? So we'll move to comments then. And the comments need to be directed at the question of, does this need a planning permission by virtuality of the materiality of the change? Councillor Pitt.
I therefore propose that this does constitute requirement for planning permission based on the standard or wording that Ian finds acceptable of accommodation, the impact on parking, waste, the amenity impacts upon neighbouring residents and the impact upon the Solent Special Protection Area.
Is there a seconder for that? Thank you. Councillor Sanders. Are there any alternative proposals? Comments? Okay, let's move to a vote then on that.
Chairman, if I can, as I promised Councillor Sanders, just like confirmation, yes, the applicant has submitted a necessary calculation confirming their willingness to make the necessary nitrates contribution in the normal way. And members, if I may, before any vote is attempted, it is important that we get the wording specifically right. So if I may, because there's a bit of a gap in Councillor Pitt's statement there, the wording I would take if I import the last wording into this
would be correct.
Wording would be that the proposal is considered to be development requiring planning permission due to the intensity of the use of the accommodation, the impact on parking, waste, amenity impact on neighbouring residents, and the impact on the Solent Special Protection Area. Obviously, that's not the decision of the committee, that's just the first part of it, but obviously that may well then translate into any other informatives or comments you wish to make in a second.
Everybody happy with that? Okay, would you like to raise your hands if you agree with that recommendation made by Councillor Pitt and Councillor Sanders? Unanimous? That's yes. So that's been agreed that we do think it needs a planning permission. We're now going to move on to comments on the question of whether or not, given that it needs planning permission, we would want to refuse the planning application or accept it, subject to conditions. Any comments from the floor? Councillor Pitt, thank you.
I don't very often say this, I'm getting sick of the sound of my own voice. I find this one particularly disappointing because on a number of occasions when we have been upheld and our decisions at appeal, it's been where existing living space has clearly been removed purely to create an additional bedroom to let. And that, I believe, is contrary to our policy, because our policy is to ensure quality accommodation for our residents. So allowing any decision that reduces the quality of that accommodation by taking it away when it was there is a willingness to say, I want the income from the extra bedroom rather than the quality of life for the residents. Now, I know that will vary from landlord to landlord, and that some will say, yes, but I've done this and I've done that. But in principle, removing a quantity of communal space that exists purely to create an extra bedroom should be unacceptable. It has been deemed to be unacceptable by a number of inspectors when we've gone to appeal, and we have won a number of those cases, not least one of the ones that we just looked at today around an enforcement issue. So I'm particularly disappointed that that's what the inspector said. However, the inspector has said it, and that is material to our considerations today, and so we're rather tied on this one. Whilst I don't agree, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind whatsoever, but Ian, if you could confirm for me, that would be helpful, that if we were to refuse this based on the communal standards not being in line with our policy, which was the only one of two material considerations we identified last time, that the communal standards, the previous inspector's view will be taken into account in that appeal, and therefore another inspector's unlikely to take an entirely contrary view based on the same evidence. They might do, but it's unlikely because it carries more weight because it's already gone to appeal, and therefore conditioning the nitrates issue around it to enable the development to go ahead would be sensible. I can't think of another particular reason within our policy why this one should be refused, given that that is the case. I'm hoping that one of my colleagues might come up with a solution to that issue.
Anybody else got any comments to make? I mean, this is one that has been used as 6, and even then the combined living space was too small.
You would also need the lack of Section 106 agreement in there for the nitrates and bird aware.
Any further comments? Any? So have you got a specific proposal recommendation that you're making?
No, Chair, I don't believe you have a recommendation from the floor, so I think process dictates that you are responsible for making a recommendation.
Can I assist at all, Chair?
Yes.
And
Please,
I can only imply from the one statement of the understandably reluctant comments of Councillor Pitt that an appeal inspector's looked at a key consideration, the space standards, and deemed them to be acceptable on its merits in this case. If that is the majority view of the committee, and consequently having already concluded that plan permission is required, therefore the council would be looking at the approval of plan permission subject to appropriate conditions and obligations. Those appropriate conditions would be, as a minimal, time limit, and we'd recommend 1 year in light of the nitrates implications, approved plans for the point of clarity and certainty, a condition regarding nitrates. We have a standard condition to limit the water usage and require them to make further submissions. Members have obviously in the past also considered the importance of both providing and retaining in perpetuity cycle storage and refuse storage. So members may wish to consider, if it doesn't already have adequate refuse or cycle storage for 7 people, and there will be a material change to that demand, to require them to resubmit details on those 2 matters. So there would therefore potentially be a number of different conditions members could impose should they be minded to approve plan permission, time limit, approved plans, cycle storage, refuse storage, and nitrates. Subject to those conditions, a resolution would be to approve planning permission subject to the necessary planning obligations for nitrates as well. So it would be a multi-parted conclusion, so different to the unconditional consent, which is obviously the other option available to you, but an option that would make a lot less sense if you are, as you have been, satisfied that plan permission is required.
Just one thing, there was a question asked by Mr. Paul Henry Thorpe, thank you, about the calculation of the communal area and whether it included that corridor area. I'm sorry, I meant to ask that earlier, or whether it was just the
Yes, so because it is a single room, and while parts of it will be used for transit, whether one's going from the front door to the stairway, or from the front door to the door to the top left.
So the 26
would include that whole room.
Yes, bit of corridor.
Yeah, indeed so.
So in practice, it is a smaller area in practice for actually sitting in.
I mean, by definition, all shared rooms are used for standing, sitting, and moving through. How that is shared will obviously be varied on the different layouts.
Sorry, members, I just wanted to clarify that. Is anybody willing to second that recommendation?
Chair, I'm not aware there's been a recommendation.
I thought you had. No. Okay. I remain concerned about the small size of the living area. As the last question there, we refused the application for the conditional permission was given to 6, wasn't it, in October 2012, is that right? And it's now 7. I suppose I'd like to ask Ian just one more question. The fact that the inspector hasn't mentioned the size doesn't necessarily mean that he or she had given it any thought at all, does it?
You refer to the communal living space
Yes.
clause. So we've included an extract from the appeal decision at 1.14, yes, where the inspector expressly did find that it would
not result in inadequate living conditions.
So they are satisfied that the size and orientation, the two things are obviously indistinguishable. It's the resultant quality of living environment, which obviously is your policy obligation on its own merits. It is acceptable in this case.
It's still only 26.84, including the corridor. And we have, in this case, there are other cases before us where there are much larger rooms. In this case, only one of the rooms is above 10 square metres. I would like to propose from the Chair that we do accept the fact that it is a very much smaller area than our own standing policy and recommend refusal on the grounds that we gave before, which are paragraph 1.9, paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, even though we now know that they probably would would pay for the mitigation. It's an incredibly small place a small room for 7 people, and I would like to propose that from the Chair, and if anybody else wants to second it, then they can do so. Otherwise, we'll go with an alternative recommendation, which is to approve the permission.
Chair, could Ian offer some clarity as to the nature of the proposal that you've just made and its validity? I'm just not quite sure.
No, please.
In respect of its validity, it's an entirely valid proposition. It is for the decision maker, in this case you, to determine whether or not something should be granted planning permission. You have to give due consideration to all material considerations, and the previous inspector's decision is one such material consideration. Planning is not a precedent-led system. You are not bound to follow it. The question that falls to you, I would suggest, is whether it is reasonable to effectively move that goalpost, and having made an inspector have made a judgment overruling your previous position, to reimpose your judgment above that planning inspector. Whether it's reasonable or not will clearly be for the inspectorate to judge should an appeal be made. If it's considered to be such an unreasonable position that that no reasonable authority could have reverted to their own judgment overriding the inspector's judgment, that potentially is a ground for costs against the council on that basis. But I'm not saying that is the case. That is a series of ifs following its sequence. If there's a change if we had, for example, materially changed our guidance or something like that, then there would be a reason to depart from the inspectorate's previous conclusions. In this case, that's not the case. So the inspector has judged under your current or materially similar current guidance of what would be a reasonable living environment on the individual merits, and deemed this is acceptable. You are entitled, it is valid, to disagree with him. Whether it's reasonable, and valid and reasonable are two different things, would be for an appeal and an inspector on that appeal to make a judgment, not just whether you're correct, which I would suggest is unlikely an inspector would say you were correct, but whether you are so wrong that it's an unreasonable position to have taken, such that the applicant has been put to an unreasonable cost burden of having to go to appeal and have costs awarded against the council.
I think we're faced with a very difficult decision. This is a fine grey line for all of us, but we do have our own policies to defend. I'm not making out this is an easy decision.
Thanks, Chair. It was a specific part of what you said, because I was trying to pay attention to what we were being asked to support, and you said that, and I know what you meant, that reducing the acceptability of the combined living space being below 34 square metres would normally require for a proportion of the bedrooms to be more than 10 metres square, actually all of them, and only one of them is. But nevertheless, I don't think we can cite that as a reason for us refusing it in itself, because the bedroom sizes all meet the required standard. So my real question to you, Ian,
I was
maybe
going to cite as the same reason effectively as we gave before, and try it again.
just the combined.
I'm very happy to be overruled. In a sense, you put me on the spot there, and
No, I just want to know what I'm backing, that's all. So are you just saying, Chair, that your reason for refusal is because the area provided for the combined living space falls significantly below the required standard? OK, I understand now.
particularly when that corridor is taken into account.
Chairman, if I may, what I've captured, and again, if this is incorrect, I need to ensure that's the case before it is seconded and voted upon, is that the proposal is considered to be development, etc., as just discussed, and furthermore, and then verbatim, what's provided in 1.91 and 1.12, because obviously we would have to reimpose that nitrate issue, because today there is no nitrate solution presented by the applicant. Clearly they may be able to wash that out at appeal by providing it to the inspectorate in advance of any appeal, but today it hasn't been resolved irrespective of their intent to do so. So it would be the statement that it requires development and why, and then simply furthermore, and then verbatim what's in 1.91 and 1.92 of the agenda for this item. Clearly, if members wish to emphasise some other aspect to that, they can do so as well.
I haven't even got a seconder at the moment, so I'm very happy for no seconder. Is there an alternative proposal? These are very difficult. This isn't...
Happy to second your proposal.
Are there any alternative proposals? Good. Councillor Sanders.
Well, it was only to second the proposal, but, it seems that George has beat me to it. But such as life.
Shall we move to a vote then? On that proposal backed up by the reasons given in paragraph 1.91 and 2. Sorry? All those in favour, put your hands up, please. All those against? Abstentions? This is like playing the game of being chair, isn't it? I now have to put my casting vote in now, don't I? 3?
Chair, I counted 4 in favour, 2 against and 3 abstentions.
Oh, right. OK, I miscounted then. Thank you. Then we have agreed that, again, with a heavy heart. Good. Thank you very much. Move on to the next item, which is item page 41, 331 London Road. And it's on page 41. Here we do have... Are you all happy to do one more item before we have a little comfort break? Everybody okay? Right. Okay, so that's Jonathan McDermott, the agent, is here. Is that... You're here. Chris Broyd is not here. Is there a written objection? No? Okay. Henry Thorpe is here. Thank you. David Weems, read out by Scott Pater Harris, who is excluding himself from this debate. Thank you. And you're going to put one in, a deputation of your own. Okay. So, Ian, would you like to go ahead, please, and explain this one to us?
Thank you. So,
this is 331.
331 London Road.
London Road.
There is the application site, as you can see, for HMOs within that immediate area. The existing floor plans, the proposed floor plans. It is, again, a change of use from a 6-bed HMO to a 7-bed HMO. The communal living floor space in this case is 34.2 square metres, so above your adopted standards, should members be interested in that. Because again, obviously the primary question is, on its individual merits, does this require planning permission as a material change of use or not? So again, members need to do that 2-part determination. First of all, concluding whether or not it does require planning permission, whether for similar wording is used previously or different wording, and if it does require planning permission, what conditions or obligations you would feel would be necessary to impose in a very similar way as we just discussed, but obviously tailored to the specific circumstances of this planning application. Obviously very happy to take any questions when we get to that part of the agenda.
Steve?
Yeah, 5.1 in the report, Ian, has got no content. It just says the main issues to consider in the determination of this application are principles normally listed as an entirely separate. It normally says something under there.
So, and this is probably me cutting and pasting, so I'll offer the apology for the department. I believe it reads sensibly in that semicolon leads you to 5.2 in principle, in the same way that paragraph 1.2 contains the same wording to give you the specific list of
So it's a
key
formatting
considerations.
thing.
So probably a formatting
Yeah, okay.
issue.
1.2. Thank you. Any other questions? Darren?
Just one, Ian. In 5.8, it says the proposal would increase the occupancy of the existing...
Sorry, Chair, but we have got deputations for this item.
That's
Oh,
my
I'm so
fault.
sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Quite right. We all got, yes. Deputations then. Jonathan McDermott, please. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, members. Last spoke to you on a very similar HMO that you might remember on Laburnum Grove, and I'm happy to speak to you once again for another one of these higher quality HMOs. Here we have an existing 6-person. It was granted planning permission by your authority in 2016 and has been renovated to provide occupancy for, at present, 6 people, currently occupied as such. And what the applicant is asking here is for the addition of a 7th person within the existing renovated building. I'm going to, in true inspectorate style, sidestep the question of whether or not it requires planning permission in the first instance and move straight to the benefits of the case, if I may. Ultimately, having read the room on the last application, the committee is quite rightly focused on policy, and so I want to reflect upon that policy. Here we have an existing HMO, we're adding 1 person to it. It's in an area of comparatively low density of HMOs. There are only 4 others within that 50-metre radii. All of the bedrooms within the building comply or exceed the stated policy. The amenity space, the shared communal area, exceeds the stated policy by at least 10 square metres. Nearly all of the bathrooms exceed the policy, some coming a little bit close to it, 3.7 versus 3.74. So overall, we've got an HMO that seeks to take the challenge of your policy and grapple with it head on. Moving then to the area, this part of London Road is predominated by larger building typology. It's predominated by effectively what were former naval officers' houses. Nice, big, Victorian houses. This isn't in the depths of Southsea. This is up in the northern part of the city. And suits very well the type of occupancy we have here, which is for young professionals. Overall, on its merits, this scheme, from a planning point of view, should be granted for its additional person, and we thank the officers for their recommendation in that respect. I'm not going to waste any more of your time, as you have a very busy agenda ahead of you, so I will leave it there. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Next one then. Chris Broyd is not here, still not here. Henry Thorpe.
Thank you, councillors, for your time. This is going to be my last deputation because I'm running out of time, but the last discussion was very interesting in that we had a case in Margate Road at the previous planning committee where the very high percentage of HMOs was given as a reason for refusal, and we've just done one where that wasn't even used as reasoning despite it being at over 40%. Later on in the agenda, I would encourage you to use that as a reason for dismissing about 4 or 5 of the rest of the applications. This application is in an area that is already over 10%, so it's already exceeded that policy. So therefore you need to look into the type of property that's within that area and the resources available to it. My specific passion and the reason that I'm here is actually about the community and the community effects that this has on both, that these HMOs with too many rooms in too small an area without the infrastructure within the area to support it have on the local community and people. The most common reason that you'll find for objections within that area is a selfish one on parking. Now that isn't what drives me, but I am going to talk specifically about parking with this application. This house is within 50 metres of the latest death on the roads. That death was caused, because you can see the pictures of it, by the fact that every house within this area has a maximum of 1 car parking space per house. So, you'll be surprised to hear that at 7 o'clock in the evening, because a takeaway is no longer a takeaway, it's a delivery collection port, there are cars all over the double yellow lines on the corner, and the guy's got written off where he's come out between illegally parked cars. You can see it clearly on the pictures. You have to start looking into traffic use, you have to start looking into infrastructure. If we talk specifically about this property, because I went to see it this morning so that I was informed, it's not a normal terraced house, it's tiny. If you look at the width of it, you can barely fit a double bed and open the door in one of those rooms. So the applicant's saying that the rooms are really large. They may be large, but they're not usable. And that is an overdevelopment of that site. That site offers no additional parking for that additional accommodation that they're trying to enforce. Also, I don't accept what Ian Maguire keeps saying about moving from 6 to 7 people is only one person, because it's not moving from 6 to 7 people. It's moving from 3 to 4 as a family home, on a worst case, up to 7. So it isn't just 10%. They've basically used permitted development to wipe out half the increase that they've done. Until this council starts to control permitted development of these period buildings, and it writes a policy that reflects the accommodation that the properties that it's trying to manage, we've got no hope. So my recommendation to you is that you reject this based on the HMO density, and you have a serious think about the parking provision. And in this application specifically, you mention parking, which I know normally you don't do, but because of the site, because of the area. I mean, if you look at it, Gladys Road, no additional parking. Oriel Road, no additional parking. Shadwell Road, no additional parking. London Road, below 1 car per space. There's no commercial or other activities within that area. That means that in the evening it's just a nightmare. So I would reject this application for an overdevelopment of the site. And I hope that you all have a good meeting. And please remember that what I said about the percentage of HMOs within an area. When it's up at 40%, forget about over-intensifying it even further.
Thank you for your deputation.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Scott.
Thank you. I'm going to obviously be reading out the full objection from Councillor Dan Weems, who can't be here today. I'll just read it out full verbatim, and you'll probably know when I've stopped. Okay, this week is HMO Day on the Planning Committee. Apparently PCC's policies are robust and go far beyond what other authorities permit elsewhere. I disagree with this, given the unique nature and geography of Portsmouth. We should have a unique policy specifically tailored to our city. PCC currently uses a local plan that is 10 years out of date, leading to many HMOs that should have been denied planning permission making their way past the committee out of fear of the planning inspectorate, combined with a weak Lib Dem administration who are happy to nod their heads and not enforce parts of their own policy, which has given a very poor deal to residents. 331 London Road is adding one more person to an already overdeveloped property. Multiple people coming and going at different hours, multiple cars added to an already congested road, more strain on the sewage and water system, more negative external reasons to other residents, more of the same in Portsmouth. London Road is a major artery within our city. It is often congested throughout the day. There is simply not enough space for adequate parking, and residents often find themselves parking in other areas due to the lack of parking on London Road. I cannot believe for 1 second that a 7-bedroom HMO will only have 2 occupiers with cars. Why do we have a policy for parking if we're not going to enforce it? 7 professional people, often transient workers, in an area with very little office space, usually means each occupier must travel outside of Hilsey to their workplace. This again means each tenant is likely to own a vehicle. This is at worst 7 cars in an area where there is no parking provision. Where are they going to park? I repeat myself again, when I attended the planning committee previously, I'm not against landlords who wish to own HMOs that are to a good standard and sized accordingly to the property, nor do I defend tenants who take advantage of reputable landlords. I just want a balance, and until we have the right policies in place, committee members will sit for hours looking at HMOs. I'm sorry if you're all tired and want to go home. Yes, I am actually. But you can blame the administration for the lack of action. Furthermore, I agree with several residents that I've spoken to. We do not believe that HMOs are the issue. The problem is the scale of development. I do not just see how we can justify this application until the house is actually big enough to accommodate the amount of people on the application. Gutting the property and forcing people to live on top of each other is not the answer. And that finishes Councillor Weems's deputation. So he says thank you for your considerations today. Now it's my one, if I may.
Okay, yes, certainly, proceed.
I'm not going to go down. I think Councillor Weems has covered a lot of points, and I'm not going to go down there. I mean, I'm looking at the application. I've heard the words of Mr. Thorpe behind me. I think Mr. Thorpe makes some actually general points about the parking provision in that area, and I think that is an important thing to look at. It is not what I would call down a conventional road, for example. It is a main artery in the city. We have had a recent accident in the city where that was from, unfortunately, there were cars parked illegally. You know, someone's walking out a side street. That has happened. You know, we have to really look at that. But then I think it's down to this committee that we have policies in place that we need to utilise. And it was quite heartening, Chair, to see you use the policy in the last application. I think I'm looking at this application now, and in the report, while it does make mention of the room standard size, there are 3 en-suites which are undersized, and the agent actually did make reference to those. He said the majority of them are by 1, so I would probably say you've got 40% of them aren't actually that size. So I think we have a policy that we should be implementing when we can, and while that's uncomfortable for this committee, and we could go to appeal and lose, that is a good chance. I mean, I want to look at the Prince Albert Road application that we talked about earlier, and that one, the space standards, were very similar to the one that we've just done, but the actual officer's recommendation was to pass it. So I think we as a committee need to make decisions. I mean, I think Councillor Pitt made it earlier, each application on its merit. I think that's important. But I mean, we have spatial standards and we have space standards for a reason. I think it's time for the committee to start enforcing them. Thank you. Want me to leave, Chair, or can I stay for the debate because I can't even contribute? It's up to you. I don't mind.
Yes, by all means do stay. Good. Okay. We're now back into the questions session that I interrupted. Thank you very much, Scott, for that. Darren, you were about to say something.
You're very kind, and thank you for your memory, Judith. It comes back to actually a point the applicant raised earlier on. The applicant says only one more person will be in this particular place. But in 5.8 of your report, it says the proposal would increase the occupancy of the existing HMO by 4 occupants. Who's right?
As always, both. So the application site is licensed for 6, currently licensed for 7 occupants as of the 10th of February this year. Prior to that, I again inquired before February this year, which obviously is the time in the life of this application, and we've had it for a while. It was licensed for 6 persons, but the evidence that we had from our private sector housing team was that four people were in occupation when they last made that inspection. So, depending on how you wish to interpret the choice of use of those rooms, the landowner could have occupied it by 6, but in fact only had 4 people, wanting now to go to 7. So the real occupancy could change by 1 or it could change by 3. As I say, of course, either of those things could happen without planning permission.
Right. I don't think that helps me at all, but thank you very much for that, Ian.
This is an application to move from 6 to 7, but they'd happen not to have had 6 in. Any more questions, Steve?
Ian, it's only a technical point, but just under the room standards table in 5.5, you've put the required standard as 22.5. It is, of course, 34. Is that correct?
I think it's because they're all over 10 metres squared.
In this case, because they're all over 10 metres squared, your guidance allows...
All rooms over 10 metres
squared? All the bedrooms are over 10 metres squared, so the requirement is only for 22.5.
Okay.
They're all large than normal. Steve?
There was some points brought up by Councillor Weems in his deputation. I think it's probably quite important because we've got some new members on the committee who haven't been through this hell for so long. the SPD as it currently stands is an amended form of the SPD that was updated previously under Councillor Donna Jones as council leader, where we sought to limit the number of additional rooms added, i.e. sewage C4 to Suez, effectively was what we were talking about at the time, by saying that if the 10% limit was already exceeded, we would presume refusal for them. You, Ian, then arrived as we were getting a flurry of responses from the inspectorate refusing to uphold that view and taking the view that it was not material because the property was already an HMO, which is where we got the amended words from now. So I don't like to make political points, but I didn't start it. The policy that was failing was the policy set by the Conservative administration for HMOs to say that if the 10% rule was exceeded, then SUI applications would be presumed to be turned down. We supported that view at the time, but we can't rewrite history. We were all on the same page at that point. It's unfortunate now to be blaming a policy that statistically has actually had more success in standing up at appeal than the previous policy did. I'm sure we all find that equally unfortunate in the case of the previous policy, but it is not the case that this administration was responsible for it. It was passed under Councillor Donna Jones. That's just a factual correction of the process. That doesn't change the fact that collegiately we are all in the same place.
And I mean, just to ask a follow-up question on that one, Ian, have we successfully used any reason for refusing an application of this nature, or indeed an application for just adding one extra room by citing the density of HMOs anywhere?
No, because your policy, obviously there's still the policy and the guidance, and your policy hasn't changed throughout this period. No. It's that guidance document that was updated. Your guidance is a mix and balance community argument, and to make that calculation there. Obviously one could, and I could sit here and do the arithmetic to work out the bedrooms versus homes, but the challenge with doing that in an attempt to talk to mix and balance communities is the challenge I mentioned earlier when I gave you my own personal example. When I changed the occupancy of a home, I changed the use of a room. My office became a bedroom. My spare bedroom became a nursery, so on and so forth, as circumstances change, and that happens to everyone's home, frankly, on a daily basis. A lot more home offices around these days, and on that basis it's very hard to judge occupancy of dwellings and thus compare one set of home dwellers to another. To say that there's, we can tell you how many people are in an HMO because they're pretty much all licensed for certainly the larger ones, but we have no idea how many people are in individual homes on a case-by-case basis. Obviously something to look at from the 2021 census when it's published later this year perhaps, but no, it doesn't form part of your policy basis or your guidance, and consequently it's never been a reason to withhold plan permission.
And while we're on another question from the chair, which is the paragraph, page 44, amenity and parking. There were quite a lot of concern raised in the deputations about parking. Do you have any more comments about parking, given that in a sense the occupancy, the existing occupancy of 4 occupancy is irrelevant to us in a way? Do we have any precedent of controlling HMO development by talking about parking?
Yes and no, in a sense. It's part of your overall control policy, part of the reason you seek to balance the communities to make those. Your evidence, your parking standards in this case, confirms that the amount of parking provision for a 6-bed and a 7-bed HMO is expected to be the same. So you have no evidence and thus policy basis to withhold plan permission suggesting, and again, of course, there is 1/6 more likelihood of a requirement for parking, but that is not a material issue in officers' issues. You haven't got to that question yet. You'll need to answer that for this one, of course, as well. But certainly, even if that was the case, your standards identify that there's so little change in that it wouldn't be a reason to withhold plan permission, should you get to that point.
Thank you. So we've done any further questions? If there are no further questions, then oh, Lynn, I'm so sorry.
You left me out. It's all right. I forgive you.
Lynn.
And just coming back to a question, nothing material. I didn't think that. Steve made. Why is it such a variation in the required space in living accommodation? Because there are at least 3 that I've gone through, which are requiring 34 metres squared, and 2 at least, which require 22.5 metres. Now, is that an error?
Yeah.
Through you, Chair, this is an importation from the private sector housing guidance, which we updated our SPD to ensure it was in line with. The logic provided in far more detail within that guidance document is that where you have significantly larger dwellings, again, these are single occupancy bedrooms, which only need to be 6.5 metres squared to meet our requirements. When they're significantly larger, 10 plus metres, that gives occupiers of the house an alternative place to rest, to sit. In a small single bed, single room where there's nowhere to go, you're not going to perch on the end of your bed. In a 10 square metre bedroom, you've got room for a bed and a desk, or bed and a chair. So consequently, they have alternatives rather than having to 100% rely on the communal space for that amenity opportunity. So where every bedroom, every occupant has the opportunity for some private amenity space within their own room, then there's an allowance for a reduction to the communal amenity space provided.
So you're okay if you're large, and you've got 7 large people going into one with 34.5 or 34 metres squared, but you'd have to have thin people going into, or small people going into the 22 metre ones.
No,
Am I right?
it's obviously to do with the larger
Because
room.
this has nothing to do with the size of the bedroom, it's the size of the individuals living in the living space, surely.
Few people are larger than 10 square metres.
Okay. Just seems a
the
bit
point,
mad
the
to
point
me.
about this one, though, which is interesting, is that in fact there is 34 square metres, despite the fact
yes, I
that
know.
technically under our guidance it's not
So
necessary.
I just wondered, whether the 22 one was for small people and the other one was for large people. Just a question. Thank you.
Any further questions? So we're going to first of all ask ourselves the question whether or not planning permission is required. We've listened to deputations, and we've looked at the size standards, which are very different from the ones we've looked at before. And any comments about whether it needs planning permission or not? Steve?
Whilst treating this application separately and it's on its own merits, I would suggest that the agreed wording for the previous application would apply equally valid for this one, and provide you with the reason to decide that it does require planning permission.
And are there any contrary views or a second? A seconder? Do you want to second it?
I'm happy to second that on the proviso that the word intensification is used as per previously. Thank you.
Would you like to vote on that, please? Hands up if you agree that it does require planning permission. That's everybody except for Scott, who's excluding himself from this vote. Good. Now we need to move on to the question of whether or not this should be granted planning permission or whether it should be refused. Darren.
Thank you, Judith. I have to say that I'm in two minds on this particular one. The logic of our previous decisions, which has been focused very much upon space standards, would mean that this would go through. However, I have listened to both what Councillor Pater Harris and Mr Thorpe have said, particularly around parking in this area, which I know from the development at Doyle Avenue is of particular interest to people, and that makes me in two minds, frankly, to be honest, so I will listen to other colleagues. I do, though, for the benefit of newbies and people looking, do wish to follow up on Steve's comments about some of the comments that Councillor Weems has made, because they affect also what Mr Thorpe was saying earlier on. For those who don't know, the old planning committee and the cabinet met Ian Maguire and the team precisely to discuss HMO issues. Councillor Weems was on that call. I was delighted that he was on that call because he made some constructive contributions around that. But in that, all colleagues were made aware of the issues with which several of us have been grappling. Councillor Pater Harris and myself, involved in housing, have also been trying to grapple with some of these over the past several years. As far as this application is concerned, the horse has bolted. This was granted as a HMO in November 2016. And so it has been the principle of it being a HMO has been there for years. And I think that's the first issue. Mr. Thorpe is absolutely right when dealing with saturation zones. It's something I first raised with planning officers way back in 2013 for precisely the reasons that we existed in 85 Margate Road, and we will deal with once we come back from our comfort break. It seems logical, as in licensing, to have saturation zones in key areas. We know that with areas of particularly high concentrations of HMOs are where most of the problems that people worry about exist. But I have been told, and this will be a refrain that will come up over the next few minutes, that the planning inspector would not tolerate that. Not at the administration of the time, which happened to be us, but that the planning inspector would not tolerate that. That is highly depressing. But that was a refrain that came through pretty constantly in the discussions that we all had. It was my colleague Lee Hunt who first put forward the idea of actually restricting HMOs to the 10% rule. We would like to do it on every street, and we said so at the time. Unfortunately, it was the planning inspector who gave us the 50-metre radius approach, and we decided that half a loaf was better than none. So that's why we went with it. Do we like it? Not particularly, but it is better to have something than nothing. My final point, another point, there are various other tactics that we can use, and that's why when Councillor Weems and Councillor Swan told all councillors they were very keen to introduce additional licensing small HMOs, I was delighted to tell them that was something that this administration was wanting to do anyway, subject to consultation. And I'm delighted that we've got consensus around that. As Steve said, we all want to work together to try and deal with these issues. With regards to permitted development, which was raised earlier on, I was also at 83 Margate Road, so I do remember Mr. Maguire's comparison earlier on. And my view is that permitted development drives a coach and horses through a lot of these things. That's perfectly legal, it remains my view, and it doesn't cloud my individual judgment, but it is there. And I know that both Councillor Vernon Jackson and I have been trying to look to see whether we can actually put forward Article 4 directions to try and deal with that issue. Again, the issue has been, would the planning inspector allow it? So I think, contrary to what Councillor Williams has said, we've not been weak over the last 4 years. All of us, regardless of political party, have been trying to grapple with these issues. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. But I would say if anybody is tired, you can blame the administration, because it's Councillor Vernon Jackson who insists that every single one comes to the committee. I know some of our officer colleagues believe that's wrong. I understand that opinion. I don't agree with it. As I said at the briefing we all had on Monday, I think it's the right way forwards in terms of openness and transparency, and by working together on these issues we can actually try and get the best deal for the city. Apologies that that's a bit more than 5 minutes, Judith.
Thank you very much. Any more comments, and moving towards an agreement about whether... George?
We've discussed previously with HMOs about cycle storage, and it's quite absent from this as to whether there's any cycle storage at all. We normally expect to see 4 spaces for a HMO of 6 to 7 persons. I'd like to get clarification. I probably should have come under a question rather than a comment, but do we have adequate cycle storage in place, and is it accessible through the property? Because we've got a particularly narrow hallway here, and it looks to be some tables in the way that might stop people being able to access that.
This is, of course, already an HMO, but it's certainly not shown on here. Could you tell us what the situation is, please?
So I'd have to ask the case officer to specifically describe the cycle storage. You're quite correct. We haven't gone into any detail within this report in light of the need for the lack of need for planning permission, which obviously the council has made its ruling on already. You move on to that second question, you've already highlighted it. The requirement for cycle storage is unaltered by this change, because your standard for cycle storage is 4, whether it be 6 or whether it be 7. So then the reasonableness of a condition requiring additional or different cycle storage would fall away, as you don't have a policy basis to do so, because whatever they're providing for is, by policy, adequate to meet a 6 or 7 bed HMO, so that wouldn't change. Clearly, though, if you have a different view for whatever articulate reason, a condition can be imposed to require details of cycle storage to be submitted within X months, or whatever other wording we can put together for you regarding a need for any changes to cycle storage.
Would we have had the policy on cycle storage when we approved the application for 6 places here?
The application was approved for 6 in November 2016.
Yes.
Your parking policy is based on 2010 data. It was produced in 2012. So yes, the policy hasn't changed in that time.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments leading to recommendation? Had one, I think some people are in 2 or 3 minds, not just 2 minds. Darren. I think it's important that this has got these big bedrooms and, in fact, a lot of storage, a lot of space. But what do others want to say? Do you want me to make a decision again? We've agreed that it is a material change and we do need to have planning permission. So we need to now decide whether or not we would give planning permission for an additional 1 bedroom, 1 person to 7 people. There would be clearly some additional rubbish, additional flushing the loo. Would we be able to, if we approve this, put a nitrates condition on it, Ian?
Certainly, on the basis plan permission is required, as already resolved, we would be suggesting you will need the minimum of a condition regarding time limit, a condition regarding approved plans, and the nitrates condition, and consequently the resolution, if that was the mind of the committee, would be to resolve to grant, subject to Section 106 approval, i.e. delegating it to officers to get that obligation, which I've had confirmed, in case anyone wants to ask that question, from the team, that the applicant is happy to make that nitrate contribution if it is deemed necessary. Which
Sure,
clearly
if we recommended this, we would want to put that on.
It will need a
It's
condition
one
and
of the reasons
obligation,
we cited
yes.
for needing a planning permission. Okay, well, just because we don't want to be here all day, I will propose that we should approve this one because of the space standards and the size of the bedrooms. It has the space standards it requires. Even if it had 1 or more bedrooms that were much smaller, it would need 34 metres squared, and it's got slightly more than that. And it's got these rooms that are all in excess of 10 metres squared, this one at 10.5. It seems to me this is a completely different size than the application we looked at previously, and if we have determined as we have that it needs planning permission, I would propose that, subject to the conditions which we've just been through of nitrates contribution and a contribution on the other 2 points that you raised, Ian, we should I would move a decision to recommend this one. Do I have a seconder at all? John, thank you. Does anybody want to speak against and propose that we refuse it? No? Okay. Those in favour put their hands up to say if they agree with us granting this planning permission subject to those additional conditions that Ian has read out. Anybody abstaining? 2 abstentions and the other. Anybody against? Didn't see any? No, good. Thank you. Let's move on then to the next application, which is on page 47, 34 Queen's Road.
Chair.
Do you want a break now, or do you want?
Yes, please.
We'll have a comfort break back in 5 minutes.
Chair, I shan't be here when we reconvene. Wish you all well for the remainder of the day.
Say that. Thank you very much indeed.
Can I suggest 10 minutes? Yeah.
All right. 10 minutes as long as you're actually back. I think we always slip a bit. How could I refuse?